I am Desmond, 72 years old, and I spent 40 years building an empire from the ground up. Last Sunday, my son's white fiancée sat at my dining table, looked me dead in the eye, and slid a $5 million invoice across the mahogany. She smiled, confident that the old black man would just sign his fortune away to keep the peace. My son had warned me she would do this. I looked at her, smiled back, and uttered two words that shattered her perfect delusion. Trust locked. Before I tell you how her face completely melted, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not bought. Now let me tell you exactly how this war started. Tap, tap, tap. Victoria's long acrylic nails drummed against the solid oak of my dining table. She did not ask. She did not suggest. She simply pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope toward my plate right next to the roast beef I had spent hours preparing. I did not touch the envelope. I just looked at the bold letters printed on the front. Wedding and brand sponsorship, $5 million. I looked at Victoria. 30 years old, blonde, draped in a silk dress that cost more than my first delivery truck. She sat there in my house, a house paid for by decades of hauling freight up and down the East Coast, acting like she was the absolute queen of the castle. She had been dating my son for barely 8 months, and already she treated me like an annoying employee whose only job was to fund her lavish lifestyle. Then I looked at my son, Jamal, 32 years old, the current CEO of the logistics empire I built from a single rusty van into a billion-dollar operation. Right now, Jamal was staring at his mashed potatoes, his shoulders slumped. To anyone else, he looked like a defeated man, a man completely under the thumb of his aggressive fiancée. But Jamal and I had a secret. We had rehearsed this exact moment 3 days ago in my private study. Jamal had come to me exhausted and furious, holding a folder of evidence proving Victoria was part of a larger scheme targeting wealthy families. He asked me to be the bait so we could expose her entirely. I gladly accepted. Victoria mistook my silence for confusion. She let out a soft, patronizing sigh, leaning forward as if speaking to a slow child. "Look, Desmond," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "I know $5 million is a lot of money for someone from your generation to process. But this is the modern world. This is Silicon Valley. Jamal is stepping into the absolute elite circles now. White elite circles, if we are being completely honest." She paused, letting that racial microaggression hang in the warm air of the dining room, testing me. I kept my face entirely blank. "He needs this wedding," she continued, waving her hand dismissively. "He needs my family's connections to survive in these rooms. The $5 million covers the chateau in France, the celebrity performers, and a full public relations team to manage our personal brand. If you do not sign this, he will be laughed out of the boardroom. You do not want your son to be a social pariah just because you are too stubborn to open your checkbook, do you?" The sheer audacity of this woman was almost impressive. She was weaponizing my son's race and corporate status, trying to guilt-trip an old man into funding her vanity project. She thought I was just some tired retiree who got lucky. She had no idea that back in the 1970s I negotiated contracts with mobsters, racists, and ruthless corporate sharks. A spoiled girl with a fake smile was absolutely nothing to me. I picked up my cloth napkin and dabbed my mouth. I finally reached out and placed my hand on the envelope. Victoria leaned back, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. She practically tasted the money. She thought she had won. She thought the old man had caved. I slid the envelope right back across the table. It stopped exactly 1 inch from her wine glass. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the heavy weight of 40 years of giving orders. Victoria's smile vanished instantly. Her perfectly manicured hands twitched. "Excuse me, did you not hear what I just said? Jamal's entire future depends on this." "Jamal's future is completely secured," I replied, looking right through her. "Because he actually works for a living. I am not funding a $5 million party, so you can play pretend on the internet." Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She turned to my son, expecting him to leap to her defense. "Jamal, say something to him. Tell him how important this is to our brand. Tell him he needs to sign the check." Jamal kept his head down, gripping his fork tightly. "It is his money, Victoria," he mumbled, playing his part as the submissive partner flawlessly. "He decides what to do with it." She slammed her hands on the table so hard the silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. The mask was completely off now. The sweet, concerned fiancée was gone, replaced by a desperate, greedy stranger with absolute venom in her eyes. "You senile old fool," she hissed, dropping all pretense of respect. "You think you can just embarrass me? You think you can hold your dirty trucking money over my head? I am giving your son legitimacy. Without me, he is just another diversity hire trying to play with the big boys. You owe me this money." I leaned back in my chair, interlaced my fingers, and looked at her with a calm that I knew would infuriate her beyond reason. "You are not getting a single dime, Victoria," I said smoothly. "And even if Jamal begged me on his hands and knees, I could not give it to you. Trust locked." The words hung heavy in the air. Trust locked. It was a financial term she clearly recognized, and the blood drained rapidly from her face. It meant every single asset, every bank account, every piece of real estate I owned was sealed tightly in an irrevocable blind trust. I had enacted the emergency clause the moment Jamal warned me about her true intentions earlier that week. Not even a federal judge could force me to liquidate those funds without a grueling 6-month legal review process. The $5 million she desperately needed right now was completely legally and permanently out of her reach. She stared at me, her chest heaving as she processed the crushing reality of her defeat. The realization that she had wasted 8 months manipulating my son, playing the loving partner, all for absolutely nothing, hit her like a freight train. She was trapped, and she knew I was the one who had locked the cage. Without warning, Victoria grabbed her heavy crystal glass of red wine. In one swift, violent motion, she hurled the contents straight across the table. The dark red liquid splashed violently across my face and soaked deeply into my crisp white dress shirt. The cold wine dripped down my chin, staining my collar. Jamal finally jumped up from his chair, his eyes wide with manufactured shock. "Victoria, what is wrong with you? Have you lost your mind?" She ignored him completely. She leaned across the table, her face inches from mine, her eyes blazing with a pure, unadulterated hatred. "You old bastard!" she spat, her voice trembling with intense rage. "You just started a war. You have no idea what I am capable of doing to your family." I did not flinch. I did not raise my hand to wipe my face. I just sat there, letting the wine drip onto the floor, and offered her the coldest, most terrifying smile I had. "Good," I whispered. I was getting incredibly bored of retirement anyway. "Make your next move carefully." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the dining room. The front door slammed so hard the windows shook in their frames. Jamal and I were left alone in the quiet house. He looked at my ruined shirt, then looked into my eyes. The facade of the weak sun dropped immediately. "She took the bait, Dad," Jamal said softly. "Yes, she did, son," I replied, finally grabbing a napkin to wipe my face. "And by tomorrow morning she is going to realize exactly why you never mess with a man who built his own empire." I woke up at 5 in the morning, a habit permanently carved into my bones from decades of managing a massive logistics empire. The morning after the disastrous Sunday dinner felt deceptively calm. I went through my usual routine. I took a hot shower, shaved with a straight razor, and put on a tailored navy blue suit. I did not need to dress up for retirement, but a man who built his wealth from absolutely nothing never leaves his house looking like he has nothing to lose. I took my morning walk to a high-end cafe in the center of the financial district, a place where I usually sat and read the morning financial papers. The barista, a young man named Leo who knew my order by heart, handed me my black coffee. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out my corporate expense card. It was a heavy metal card tied directly to the executive accounts of my logistics company, a company I built with my own 2 hands. I swiped it through the card reader. A sharp, unpleasant beep echoed across the marble counter. Leo frowned, staring at the digital screen. "I am sorry, Mr. Desmond," he said, his voice dropping to a polite whisper. "It says the card is restricted. The system says you need to contact your corporate administrator." I stared at the little digital screen. Restricted. I had founded the company. I had built the entire accounting department from scratch back when we only had 3 delivery trucks. And now my executive card was blocked over a $6 cup of coffee. I did not need to guess who was behind this sudden administrative block. Victoria. She had wasted absolutely no time. As the soon-to-be wife of the current CEO, she had clearly marched into the corporate office this morning, threw her weight around, and demanded the finance team freeze the old man's account. She used her proximity to Jamal to bypass standard protocols. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to send a clear, aggressive message that she controlled my son, she controlled the company, and by extension, she controlled me. She genuinely thought she could cut off my oxygen and force me to come crawling back to her, begging for access to my own money so she could extort her $5 million wedding budget. I calmly pulled a crisp $100 bill from my wallet, handed it to Leo, and told him to keep the change. I walked out of the cafe with my coffee, feeling a cold, calculating anger settling deep into my chest. She really thought she was playing chess with an amateur. She thought I was just some lucky old man who got soft in retirement. She had absolutely no idea that in the 1970s I fought off corrupt union bosses and ruthless corporate raiders to keep my business alive. She was walking blindly into a minefield. I returned to my empty, quiet estate. The massive iron gates closed silently behind me. I walked straight into my private study. The room was lined with dark mahogany bookshelves filled with binders and ledgers from my early days of trucking. I walked over to the third bookshelf on the right. I reached behind a thick, leather-bound encyclopedia and pressed a hidden latch. A small wooden panel popped open. Inside the hidden compartment was a cheap, prepaid plastic cell phone. It was a burner phone, completely untraceable, bought with cash 3 towns over. I took the phone, sat down in my heavy leather armchair, and powered it on. There was only one audio file saved on the device. I pressed play, and my son Jamal's voice filled the quiet room. "Dad, if you are listening to this, it means she has taken the bait," Jamal said. His voice was stripped of all the weakness and submission he displayed at the dinner table. "It means the operation is officially active." I closed my eyes and listened to the recording Jamal had left for me a week ago. "I have the final report from the private investigator." Jamal's voice continued heavy with absolute disgust. "Everything we suspected is true. Victoria is not just a gold digger looking for a free ride. She belongs to a highly organized fraud syndicate. They target wealthy, successful men, specifically minority men who have built generational wealth but might be isolated from their broader communities. Her job is to infiltrate the family, isolate the primary earner, and legally dismantle the parents. They forge legal documents, bribe corrupt medical professionals, and liquidate every single asset into untraceable offshore accounts before anyone even realizes what is happening. The recording paused as Jamal took a deep, shaky breath. "She thinks I am a fool, Dad. She thinks I am just a weak diversity hire who is so desperate for validation from the white elite that I will let her walk all over my family. She thinks she has me completely brainwashed. She thinks I am too blind to see the poison she is pouring into my life. We need to let her think she is winning," Jamal explained, outlining the ruthless strategy we had built together in the shadows. "Let me play the submissive, pathetic partner. Let me act like I am completely under her spell. I need to stay close to her to gather the digital evidence of her network, her bank transfers, and her accomplices. You have to be the bait. You have to be the stubborn, arrogant old man who stands in her way. She will attack you, Dad. She will try to ruin you, humiliate you, and strip you of your rights. You have to take the hits until she exposes her entire operation." "I will not let her take what you built," Dad Jamal whispered fiercely at the end of the recording. "We are going to burn her world to the absolute ground." I turned off the burner phone and placed it back into the hidden compartment. I felt a surge of immense pride for my son. He was brilliant, ruthless, and fiercely loyal to his blood. Victoria thought she was playing him like a fiddle, but Jamal was the one directing her every single move. The restricted credit card this morning was just the beginning of her aggressive tactics. She was trying to corner me. She wanted me to panic. Suddenly, the sharp chime of my front doorbell echoed through the large house. I glanced at the security monitors mounted on my desk. A plain white van was parked directly in front of my driveway. There were no medical logos on the side of the vehicle, just heavily tinted windows and a license plate covered in mud. Standing on my front porch were 3 people. One was a tall, thin, white man wearing a pristine white doctor's coat and holding a thick leather clipboard. Flanking him on either side were 2 massive, muscular men wearing dark blue scrubs. They did not look like nurses or medical professionals. They looked like violent bouncers hired from a criminal nightclub. Their arms were crossed, and their eyes scanned the perimeter of my property like predators. I adjusted my suit jacket, took a deep breath, and prepared to play the role of my life. I walked down the grand staircase and opened the heavy wooden front door. The man in the white coat gave me a wide, predatory smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Desmond," he said, his voice dripping with fake professional concern. "I am Dr. Aris. We were sent here by your future daughter-in-law, Victoria." I stared at him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. And why exactly would Victoria send a doctor to my house uninvited on a Monday morning? Dr. Aris let out a heavy, patronizing sigh, looking at me as if I were a confused toddler. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, while the two massive orderlies stepped up onto the porch, blocking my view of the street. "Well, Mr. Desmond," he said smoothly, tapping his pen against his clipboard. "Victoria is deeply concerned about your recent erratic behavior, the aggressive outbursts, the financial confusion, the delusions of grandeur you displayed at the dinner table last night. She requested that we come and perform an emergency evaluation of your mental faculties. She believes you are suffering from rapid onset dementia, and she has asked us to determine if you need to be permanently relocated to a secure, locked psychiatric facility for your own safety." The threat was absolute and immediate. Victoria was not just trying to take my money, she was trying to take my freedom. She had sent a corrupt doctor to my doorstep to declare me legally insane and lock me away in a padded room. I looked at the doctor. I looked at his two hired thugs. I knew that if I fought back, if I yelled or tried to slam the door, they would use it as documented proof that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. They wanted a violent reaction. They needed a reaction to justify dragging me out of my own home. So I did the one thing they did not expect. I stepped back, opened the door wider, and gave them a trembling, weak, confused smile. "Please come in, gentlemen," I said, making my voice sound shaky and incredibly frail. "I have been feeling a little confused lately. I think I really do need some help." I led Dr. Aris and his two massive orderlies into my living room. I shuffled my feet, deliberately dragging my expensive leather loafers across the hardwood floor. I let my shoulders droop. I hunched my back, making myself look significantly smaller than my true height. I made my hands tremble like dry leaves in a cold winter wind. "Sit down, Mr. Desmond," the doctor said. It was not a medical suggestion. It was a cold, calculated command. One of the muscular orderlies stepped forward and pushed a heavy mahogany armchair directly behind my knees, forcing me to sit down heavily. He immediately stood right behind my chair, crossing his thick arms over his chest. I could hear the fabric of his dark blue scrubs stretching over his muscles. The physical intimidation was obvious and deliberate. They wanted me to feel completely trapped in my own home. They wanted me to feel small, helpless, and terrified. The doctor pulled a stack of papers from his leather clipboard and slammed them onto my glass coffee table. "This is a standard medical consent form," he said smoothly, his voice devoid of any actual empathy. "It gives me temporary medical authority to evaluate your cognitive decline. It also gives me the legal right to recommend immediate psychiatric confinement if I deem you a danger to yourself or others. Sign it at the bottom." I looked at the silver pen he shoved aggressively into my shaking hand. I looked up at him with wide, confused, and frightened eyes. "I do not understand," I whispered, making my voice crack perfectly. "Why are you people in my house? Where is my wife? I need to speak to my wife. My wife passed away 10 years ago from a sudden illness, but playing the confused, heartbroken widower was the perfect touch to sell my performance." The doctor rolled his eyes and scoffed. "Your wife is gone, old man. Just sign the paper." I let the silver pen drop from my clumsy fingers. It rolled across the glass table and fell onto the expensive Persian rug. "I cannot sign anything without my son," I stammered, staring blankly at the blank television screen on the wall. "Where is the boy? Where is my son? What is his name again?" "Jimmy. Jason. Tell my boy to come here." Dr. Aris let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He looked back at his hired goons and shook his head in absolute amusement. "He does not even remember Jamal's name," the doctor sneered. "This is going to be incredibly easy. Way easier than Victoria promised. Pick up the pen, Desmond. Sign the paper right now, or my men will physically guide your hand and force you to do it." I slowly reached down and picked up the pen. I made my hand shake so violently that the signature I scribbled on the consent form looked like the frantic, meaningless scratches of a frightened child. It was completely illegible. It was also legally and entirely useless in a real court of law. But the arrogant, corrupt doctor did not care about strict legalities. He just needed a piece of paper with ink on it to justify his next aggressive move. "Excellent," the doctor said, snatching the clipboard back with a satisfied smirk. Now sit here and do not move a single muscle. I need to make an urgent phone call to your future daughter-in-law to update her on your tragic mental decline." He walked out of the living room and stepped into my long hallway thinking he was completely out of earshot. What he did not know was that 40 years of surviving in the cutthroat logistics business teaches you to rigorously secure your own warehouse. 3 days ago, Jamal and I had planted military-grade microphones under every single table, behind every picture frame, and inside the light fixtures in the main areas of the house. I slowly reached into my pocket and pressed a small button on what looked like a standard hearing aid. It was not a hearing aid at all. It was a discreet custom earpiece synced directly to the hidden microphones spread throughout my estate. Dr. Eris' voice came through the earpiece crystal clear. "Victoria, it is Eris," the doctor said into his phone, pacing in my hallway. "Yes, I am in the house. We have the medical consent signed and witnessed by my men. Listen, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. The old man is completely cooked. His brain is like a wet sponge. He actually thought his dead wife was in the room, and he could not even remember your fiancé's name. He called him Jason." I heard Victoria's sharp, triumphant laugh echoing through the receiver. "Perfect," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I told you he was breaking down quickly. Can you authorize the involuntary psychiatric hold right now? I want him out of that house today." "I have the paperwork ready," Eris replied, pacing back and forth. "But you explicitly said you needed to handle a major business transaction before I lock him up in the ward. If I commit him right now, the state takes over his immediate assets until the court officially appoints a guardian. You need him sitting right there in his living room, coherent enough to sign so you can execute your own documents legally." "I am on my way," Victoria said, her voice vibrating with absolute greed. "I am bringing my private lawyer." "Keep him scared, Eris. Do not let him eat or drink. If he tries to call anyone, let your dogs break his phone. I want him desperate." "Understood," the doctor said, and hung up the call. I sat in my armchair, keeping my head bowed and my hands trembling for the benefit of the guards. Inside my chest, my heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic, and terrifying precision. I was not a victim. I was a spider sitting patiently in the center of a very large, very deadly web. And the flies were marching right in willingly. 4 long, agonizing hours passed. The 2 orderlies stood like stone statues in my living room, refusing to let me even go to the kitchen for a glass of water. I played the part flawlessly. I sat in heavy silence, occasionally muttering nonsense to myself to keep the doctor entirely convinced of my severe dementia. It takes a massive amount of discipline for a man who used to command thousands of employees to sit still and accept humiliation from hired thugs. But I knew the payoff would be biblical. At exactly 3:00 in the afternoon, the heavy front door swung open without anyone knocking. Victoria walked in. She was no longer wearing the elegant, soft silk dress from our Sunday dinner. She wore a sharp, tailored black business suit. She looked like a ruthless executive preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. Walking right beside her was a slick man in a tight gray suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. He had the cold, dead eyes of a Wall Street shark. "Well, well, well," Victoria said, clicking her high heels across my hardwood floor and looking down at me with pure disgust. "How the mighty have fallen. You look absolutely terrible, Desmond." I looked up at her, blinking rapidly as if I was struggling intensely to focus my vision and recognize her face. "Who are you?" I whispered, shrinking back into my chair. She laughed, a loud, mocking sound that echoed off my high ceilings. "Save the pathetic act, old man," she snapped, dropping her purse onto my sofa. "I do not care if you know who I am or not. You only need to know how to sign your name on the dotted line." She snapped her fingers sharply. The lawyer stepped forward, opened his briefcase with a loud click, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slapped them down heavily on the glass table right in front of me. I read the bold black heading printed at the very top of the first page. "Transfer of total company control and power of attorney." "What is this?" I asked, making my voice sound incredibly weak and terrified. "What are you making me do?" "This is your only way out," Victoria said, leaning over the table until her face was inches from mine. I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with raw ambition. "You are sick, Desmond. You are losing your mind quickly. My associate, Dr. Eris here, has officially diagnosed you with severe, irreversible dementia. He has the medical paperwork ready to drag you out of this house, throw you into a locked psychiatric facility, and pump you full of heavy sedatives for the rest of your miserable short life." I let out a soft, pathetic gasp, sinking even deeper into the cushions of my chair. "But I am a merciful future daughter-in-law," Victoria continued, smiling wickedly. "If you sign these papers transferring total voting control of your logistics company to me and granting me full power of attorney over your entire estate, I will tell the doctor to go home. You can stay in your nice house with a private nurse. You sign the company over to me right now, or you get locked in a padded cell today. There is no third option, Desmond." The lawyer clicked a premium heavy fountain pen and held it out to me, his face an emotionless mask. "Sign the papers, Mr. Desmond," the lawyer said coldly. "It is for your own good." I looked at the pen. I looked at the muscular orderlies cracking their knuckles in anticipation. I looked at the corrupt doctor holding a medical syringe he had just pulled from his coat pocket as a silent threat. And finally, I looked at Victoria, whose eyes were burning with a desperate, blinding greed. She really thought she had backed a lion into a corner. She thought she had stripped me of all my power and dignity. She was forcing me to hand over $1 billion empire or face the absolute horror of a mental asylum. I reached out with a violently shaking hand and took the pen. The heavy silver fountain pen felt like a block of ice in my trembling hand. I kept my head bowed, letting my chin rest near my chest, playing the part of a broken, defeated old man. Above me, Victoria was breathing heavily, a predator watching her prey take its final breath. The slick lawyer tapped his expensive leather shoe against my hardwood floor, impatient to finalize the theft of a lifetime. The two massive orderlies stood by the door, blocking any hope of escape, while the corrupt doctor casually played with the cap of a medical syringe. They all thought they had won. They looked at me and saw a frail, terrified 72-year-old man whose mind was slipping away into the dark. But behind my clouded, blinking eyes, my mind was sharper than a razor. I pressed the gold nib of the pen against the thick paper of the transfer document. I forced my hand to shake violently. A small drop of black ink splattered against the page. Victoria let out a sharp sigh of annoyance, but she did not pull the paper away. She needed this signature. She needed it to steal my company, my legacy, and my life. As I slowly began to scratch my name onto the dotted line, a profound sense of amusement washed over me. Victoria truly believed she was a mastermind. She thought her little parlor trick with a fake doctor and a couple of hired thugs was the pinnacle of intimidation. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. I survived the 1970s in America as a young black man trying to build a business in an industry dominated by people who hated my very existence. I had to walk into smoke-filled rooms with ruthless union bosses who would not even shake my hand. I had to negotiate with racist bank managers who kept loaded shotguns on their desks just to remind me of my place. I had my delivery trucks vandalized, my tires slashed, and my life threatened more times than I can count. I built my logistics empire by outsmarting wolves, sharks, and monsters who would have gladly buried me in the dirt. Did this entitled 30-year-old woman really think a tailored suit and a forged medical certificate were enough to break me? I continued to drag the pen across the paper, making my handwriting look erratic and weak. But every single stroke was calculated. I did not just sign my name. I executed a specific, highly classified protocol that I had established with my federal banking administrators 20 years ago. I left the top loop completely off the letter D. I deliberately disconnected the M from the rest of my name, leaving a visible quarter-inch gap. Finally, I angled the last letter sharply to the left instead of the right. To Victoria and her cheap lawyer, it looked exactly like the messy, uncoordinated signature of a man suffering from severe dementia. But to the elite financial institutions and federal courts that held my trust, it was a blaring, silent alarm. It was a registered duress signature. It meant that the person signing this document was under immediate physical threat and the signature was legally void. Furthermore, it automatically triggered a quiet freeze on all corporate assets and alerted the fraud division of the Federal Banking Authority. I was not handing her my company. I was handing her a ticking time bomb. I finished the last stroke and let the heavy pen slip from my fingers. It clattered against the glass table. I slumped back into my armchair, letting my mouth hang slightly open, staring blankly at the wall. Victoria snatched the documents off the table so fast she nearly tore the paper. She held the pages up to the light, her eyes scanning the messy signature. A slow, wicked, triumphant smile spread across her face. The sheer greed radiating from her was almost physical. "See how easy that was, old man," she whispered, her voice dripping with pure malice. "You should have just written the check for my wedding when you had the chance. Now I own the bank. I own the trucks. I own everything you ever built." She turned to the lawyer and handed him the paperwork. "File this immediately. I want total corporate control transferred by tomorrow morning." The lawyer nodded, sliding the stolen empire into his leather briefcase. "It will be done, Victoria." She looked over at the corrupt doctor and waved her hand dismissively. "We are done here, Ares. You can leave him. He is no longer a threat. He is just a ghost in his own house." The doctor smirked, putting the syringe back into his pocket. "Have a good evening, Mr. Desmond," he mocked. "Try not to forget where your bedroom is." The two orderlies stepped away from the door. Victoria turned on her heel, her high heels clicking loudly against the floor, echoing like the march of a conquering army. She did not look back. They all walked out of my house, pulling the heavy oak front door shut behind them. The loud click of the lock echoed through the silent house. I waited 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. I listened closely as the sound of their vehicles faded down the long driveway. When the house was completely dead and silent, the frail, trembling old man vanished. I sat up straight. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the familiar strength return to my spine. My hands were perfectly steady. My mind was crystal clear. The performance was over, and now it was time to close the jaws of the trap. I stood up and walked briskly down the hallway to my private study. I bypassed the burner phone I had used earlier. This required a completely secure, encrypted line. I went to my desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a satellite phone that I only used for top-tier corporate emergencies. I needed to call Arthur Sterling. Sterling was not just a lawyer, he was a legal butcher. He had been my chief corporate counsel for 30 years. He knew where all the bodies were buried, and he knew exactly how to activate the poison pill contracts we had hidden deep inside the company's structure. With the duress signature now in play, I needed Sterling to file the federal injunction and prepare the FBI dossier on Victoria's fraud ring. I dialed his direct private number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. That was unusual. Sterling never let this particular line ring more than twice. Finally, there was a sharp click as the call connected. "Arthur," I said, my voice low and commanding. "The bait has been taken. Victoria just walked out of my house with the transfer documents. The duress signature is on the paper. I need you to initiate the federal lockdown protocol immediately." There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. No sound of typing, no sharp response from my lawyer, just the faint hum of static. Arthur the First repeated, my eyes narrowing. "Did you hear me?" A soft, melodic, chilling laugh echoed through the speaker. It was not the voice of a 60-year-old corporate lawyer. It was a woman's voice. "Hello, Desmond," Victoria said, her voice dripping with absolute arrogance. My blood turned to ice. I stood frozen behind my desk, gripping the heavy satellite phone. "Looking for your loyal attack dog, Arthur Sterling," Victoria asked, her tone mocking and sweet. "I have some bad news for you, old man. Arthur is not coming to the phone. He is not coming to the office tomorrow either." "What did you do?" I demanded, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "I did what you refused to do, Desmond," she purred. I opened my checkbook. "You see, everyone has a price. Even a loyal lawyer who has worked for you for 30 years. I offered Mr. Sterling a very generous early retirement package. $500,000 transferred directly to an offshore account this morning, completely untraceable. He handed over all your private access codes, forwarded this secure number to my phone, and walked away." She let out another sharp laugh, twisting the knife deeper. "Your legal protections are gone. Your corporate watchdog just sold you out for $500,000. You have no company. You have no lawyer. You have no one left to call." I stared at the wall of my study, processing the massive breach in my defenses. Sterling had betrayed me. Victoria was not just aggressive. She was incredibly well-funded, and she was moving much faster than I anticipated. "You are completely alone, old man," Victoria whispered through the phone, her voice cold and triumphant. "Enjoy your final days in that big, empty house, because by the end of the week I am taking that from you too." The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a flat line. I slowly lowered the phone to the desk. She thought she had cut off my final lifeline. She thought she had won the war. But she was about to learn that you never corner a man who has nothing left to lose. I stared at the dead satellite phone on my desk. The silence in my private study was heavy, but I did not have the luxury of mourning a bought-out lawyer. A loud screech of tires tearing up my gravel driveway broke my concentration. I looked up at the security monitors mounted on the wall. Jamal's black SUV was parked haphazardly across the pristine front lawn, crushing my rose bushes. The driver's side door flew open. Jamal stormed out, leaving the engine running and the headlights cutting through the evening darkness. I knew exactly what was happening. 2 days ago, my private security team discovered that Victoria had secretly compromised my home network. She had tapped into the interior cameras. She was watching my every move from her high-rise apartment. Jamal knew this too. This was the next phase of our plan. Jamal burst through the heavy oak front door. He did not bother to close it. His face was twisted in absolute rage. He marched straight down the hallway and into the study, waving his arms frantically. "Why are you to the brink?" He looked like a son who had He looked like a son who had finally snapped under the pressure of a stubborn, cruel father. "You made her cry, Dad," Jamal yelled, closing the distance between us. "She came back to our apartment shaking and terrified. She said you threatened her. She said you brought your corporate thugs to intimidate her." I stood my ground, playing the role of the arrogant, unyielding old man. "She is a parasite, Jamal." I yelled back, matching his intense volume. "She is trying to steal everything I built for you. You are too blind to see that she is bleeding this family dry." Jamal lunged forward. He grabbed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket. To the lenses, recording us from the corner of the ceiling, it looked like a physical assault. It looked like a desperate, brainwashed son finally resorting to violence to defend his white fiancée. He pushed me hard against the edge of the heavy wooden desk. "Just hand the company over to me," Jamal roared directly into my face. "Stop fighting us. You are ruining my life. You are destroying my future with the woman I love." As he screamed, his face turned red with manufactured fury, but his eyes were completely calm. While his left hand gripped my collar, his right hand slipped smoothly into the breast pocket of my jacket. I felt the cold, hard edge of a small metal object drop inside. "Watch it offline," Jamal whispered so softly that the room microphones could never possibly pick it up. Then he shoved me away violently. I stumbled backward, knocking over a tall stack of shipping ledgers to sell the physical struggle. The heavy books crashed to the floor. "I am done begging you, old man," Jamal shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me as I leaned against the desk. "I am the CEO of this company now. If you do not step down gracefully, we will force you out into the street." He turned around and stormed out of the house. He slammed the front door so hard the glass panes rattled in their wooden frames. Tires squealed outside as he reversed his SUV and sped away into the night. I sat heavily in my leather chair, clutching my chest as if I was having a severe panic attack. I breathed in ragged gasps, staring at the camera lens with wide, terrified eyes. I gave Victoria exactly the show she desperately wanted to see. I stayed in that chair for a full hour until the sun completely set, making sure she believed I was a broken, defeated old man. When the house was entirely dark, I slowly stood up. I walked down the narrow stairs to the basement. I had an old air-gapped laptop locked inside a heavy steel safe hidden behind some spare truck parts. The computer was never connected to the internet. Victoria could hack my cameras and my smart home devices, but she could never touch this offline machine. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the small metal flash drive Jamal had planted on me. It was heavily encrypted. I plugged it into the laptop and typed in the complex backdoor password Jamal and I had established years ago. The screen flickered to life. There were hundreds of scanned documents, bank statements, wire transfers, Interpol red notices. I clicked on the first main folder. Victoria had always paraded her parents around Silicon Valley as European old money. She claimed they owned vast estates in France and historic vineyards in Italy. She told everyone in the corporate elite that they were untouchable nobility. The high society tech billionaires ate it up completely because they worshipped a fake foreign accent. The documents on my screen told a violently different story. Her parents were not aristocrats. They were degenerate gambling addicts. Their real names were not even what they used in public. For the last 10 years, they had been running high-stakes confidence scams across Eastern Europe. They targeted wealthy widows and lonely businessmen until their luck finally ran out. They had tried to run a sophisticated card-counting scheme in an underground casino, and they crossed the absolute wrong people. I opened a translated ledger from a shadow bank in Cyprus. The numbers were staggering. They were deep in the hole, but they did not owe money to a standard bank. They owed money to a notoriously brutal faction of the Russian mafia. I scrolled down to a series of intercepted text messages and emails that Jamal's private investigators had managed to scrape from the dark web. The Russians were losing patience rapidly. The total family debt was exactly $10 million. The messages included graphic photographs of what happens to people who do not pay their international debts. Victoria was not planning a $5 million dream wedding in a French chateau. She was trying to pay a blood ransom. The $5 million she had calmly demanded at my Sunday dinner table was the exact amount the mafia required as an immediate down payment. They needed the cash by the end of the month to keep her parents breathing. If she did not deliver the funds, the syndicate was going to execute her mother and father. I sat back in the cold basement chair. The blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the dark room. Everything made brutal, perfect sense now. The aggressive rush to marry my son, the absolute desperation to seize my corporate assets, the reckless strategy of hiring a fake doctor and bribing my lead corporate lawyer. I had initially thought Victoria was just a greedy gold digger trying to buy designer clothes and social status. I was wrong. She was a cornered animal fighting for the physical survival of her family. She was running out of time. Her parents were being hunted, and my logistics empire was the only bank vault large enough to save them. She thought she had outsmarted me. She thought her little display of power with the transfer documents and the corrupt lawyer had stripped me of all my defenses. But Jamal had just handed me the greatest weapon of all. I now knew her exact timeline. I knew her deepest vulnerability, and I knew the names of the monsters hunting her. Cornered animals are the most dangerous creatures on Earth because they have absolutely nothing to lose. But they also make catastrophic mistakes when you apply the right amount of pressure. I safely ejected the USB drive and locked the laptop back inside the steel safe. I walked back upstairs into the dark, quiet house. Victoria needed my $5 million to stop the mafia from sending her pieces of her parents. She needed me to surrender. Instead, I was going to lock every single door and watch her panic. The game was no longer about corporate logistics or real estate. It was about raw survival. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. I arrived at the restaurant wearing a faded brown suit I had not worn since the 1990s. The fabric was worn thin, the elbows were shiny, and the collar was visibly frayed. I did not wear a watch. I wanted to look exactly like the broken, defeated, and irrelevant old man they desperately needed me to be. 2 days later, Victoria threw a massive welcome party for her parents. They had just flown into the United States, supposedly from their sprawling historic estate in the south of France. Of course I knew the absolute truth. I knew they had actually flown commercial out of a cheap motel in Eastern Europe, running for their lives from the Russian mob. But tonight they were playing international royalty, and they were using my money to do it. Victoria rented out the entire top floor of the most exclusive steakhouse in the financial district. There were ice sculptures, champagne towers, and waiters carrying silver trays of imported caviar. The final bill was easily going to hit $30,000. And every single penny of it was being charged directly to Jamal's corporate executive credit card. Jamal had allowed the charge to go through, deliberately building the paper trail of her financial fraud for the federal authorities. When I walked out of the elevator and stepped into the lavish dining room, the music seemed to stop. Victoria was standing by the champagne tower with her parents. Her father, Richard, wore a tuxedo that looked slightly too tight around the shoulders. Her mother, Beatrice, was draped in heavy diamonds that I knew for a fact were cheap cubic zirconia rentals. Victoria saw me, and her face twisted in absolute disgust. She walked over, dragging her parents behind her. "Mother, father, this is Jamal's dad, Desmond," she said, her voice tight with embarrassment. She did not even introduce me as the founder of the company. She introduced me like I was the janitor who had wandered into the wrong building. Beatrice looked at my frayed collar and actually took a physical step backward, as if poverty was a highly contagious disease. She offered a tight, fake smile, but kept her hands firmly clasped around her designer clutch. Richard stepped forward and gave me a weak, limp handshake. His palms were sweating. I looked directly into his eyes, and beneath the arrogant stare I saw the unmistakable, deep-rooted terror of a man who owed $10 million to ruthless killers. I reached into the pocket of my faded suit jacket and pressed the record button on a military-grade digital audio device. I was capturing every single sound in the room. We all sat down at the massive central table. Jamal sat next to Victoria, keeping his head down and playing the role of the silent, submissive partner perfectly. Throughout the entire 5-course meal, Richard and Beatrice talked loudly about their supposed wealth. They bragged about their fake vineyards, their imaginary yachts, and their high society connections in Europe. I sat at the end of the table, eating my steak in silence, playing the naive, retired truck driver. After his 4th glass of expensive scotch, Richard leaned heavily across the table. His face was flushed, and the alcohol was clearly stripping away his polished filter. He looked at me with a condescending smirk that made my blood boil. "You know, Desmond," Richard said, his voice booming over the soft restaurant music, "you did a decent job building a little delivery business from the mud. It takes a lot of manual labor to get those trucks running. I respect blue-collar workers, I really do." He paused, taking another large gulp of his drink. Victoria smiled proudly at her father. Jamal kept his eyes glued to his plate. "But let us be completely honest here," Richard continued, waving his hand dismissively at me. "Now that Jamal is marrying into our family, it is time for a real corporate transition. We operate on a global scale. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting and getting your hands dirty. But now you can step aside and let us white folks run it professionally." The blatant, disgusting racism hung heavy and toxic in the air. The entire table fell dead silent. Even the waiter standing nearby froze in shock. Decades ago, when I was a young man fighting for survival on the loading docks, I would have dragged a man like Richard across the table and thrown him straight through the nearest window for saying something like that. I had fought tooth and nail against men who thought my skin color meant I was only good for manual labor. But today, I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I swallowed the massive lump of anger in my throat. I looked at this pathetic, terrified scam artist who was marked for death by the mafia, and I gave him a wide, submissive smile. "You are absolutely right, Richard," I said, making my voice sound incredibly weak and defeated. "I am just a tired old man. I do not understand the modern corporate world anymore. I am so glad your family is here to guide my boy and take over the heavy burdens." Richard let out a loud, arrogant laugh and slapped the table. "That is the spirit, old man," he cheered, turning away to demand another bottle of champagne from the terrified waiter. I kept smiling. I knew my hidden microphone was capturing every single syllable of his racist, arrogant confession. He thought he was asserting his dominance. He had no idea he was just recording his own federal conviction. The agonizing dinner finally ended. Jamal and Victoria escorted her parents to a waiting black luxury car. I walked out to the dark underground parking lot alone. I shuffled my feet slowly, dragging them across the concrete toward my rusty sedan. As I reached for my car door handle, I heard the sharp, aggressive click of high heels echoing through the empty parking garage. I stopped and turned around. Victoria stepped out of the shadows. She was alone. The fake, sweet smile she wore for her parents was completely gone. Her eyes were cold and full of pure venom. She held a thick manila folder in her hands. "Leaving so soon, old man?" she asked, her voice dripping with malice. "Did you enjoy the dinner? I hope you ate well, because it is the last expensive meal you will ever have." I kept my head bowed, playing the victim. "I am just very tired, Victoria," I mumbled. "Please let me go home." She stepped right up to my face, invading my personal space. She slapped the heavy folder hard against my chest. I reflexively grabbed it to stop it from falling to the floor. "You are going to be a lot more tired when you read this," she whispered, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "What is this?" I asked, making my hands tremble as I held the folder. "That is your absolute ruin," she said, a wicked, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Jamal just signed the documents an hour before the dinner. He legally transferred 30% of the core company shares directly into my personal holding account." I looked up at her, widening my eyes in manufactured horror. 30%, I gasped. "He cannot do that. You do not know how to run the logistics network. I do not care about your dirty logistics network." Victoria laughed, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I care about the equity. I care about the power. With 30% of the core voting shares, I have full executive authority to force a liquidation. You lost the company, old man. You lost your son. You are completely finished." She turned on her heel and walked away, laughing into the darkness. She thought she had delivered the final killing blow. She thought she had stolen my empire right out from under me. I watched her walk away until she disappeared into the elevator. Then the trembling in my hands stopped completely. The terrified expression on my face vanished. I stood tall in the empty parking lot and looked down at the folder in my hands. She really thought she had seized 30% of my core business. She thought she could take those shares straight to the bank tomorrow morning and borrow the $5 million she desperately needed to pay off her mafia debts. She had absolutely no idea that the specific shares Jamal had transferred to her were the most toxic, radioactive assets on the face of the earth. She did not just steal a piece of my company. She had just legally claimed ownership of a massive, deadly trap. And tomorrow, when she walked into the largest bank on Wall Street, the jaws of that trap were going to snap shut right on her neck. The very next morning, Victoria walked through the towering glass doors of the most prestigious investment bank on Wall Street. I know this because I was watching her every single move through the encrypted tracking software Jamal had secretly installed on her phone. She was wearing a pristine white designer suit, carrying herself like a conquering queen. She bypassed the standard teller lines and walked straight into the private wealth management sector reserved for the absolute elite. She sat down in a plush leather chair across from a senior loan officer. She placed the manila folder on his mahogany desk with a loud, satisfying slap. She demanded a $5 million liquid cash loan. She told the banker she was the new primary shareholder of my logistics empire. She proudly presented the legal documents Jamal had signed just hours before transferring 30% of the corporate equity into her personal name. She offered those shares as absolute collateral for the immediate cash wire. What Victoria did not know was the exact nature of the shares she was holding so proudly. 5 years ago, I anticipated that my rapidly expanding logistics network might eventually face aggressive, hostile takeovers from ruthless corporate raiders. To protect my life work, I created a legal mechanism known in the financial world as a poison pill. I quietly purchased a small, bankrupt chemical transport subsidiary located deep in the Rust Belt. It was a completely dead company operating only on paper, but I kept its corporate structure alive and tucked it deep inside the outer layers of my main corporate umbrella. That dead company carried a massive radioactive secret. It was the sole target of a $50 million environmental cleanup lawsuit filed directly by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. The land the subsidiary owned was severely contaminated. Whoever held the voting equity in that specific subsidiary automatically absorbed the total legal and financial liability of the toxic waste dump. It was a financial death sentence designed to completely destroy anyone who tried to steal my company from the inside. When Jamal transferred 30% of the equity to Victoria last night, he did not give her shares of the highly profitable main logistics fleet. He legally transferred 30% ownership of the toxic bankrupt chemical subsidiary. Because she was so blinded by her arrogant greed and her desperate, frantic need to pay off her parents' mafia debt, she did not read the small print. She saw my famous company logo at the top of the contract and blindly signed her own financial death warrant. Inside the Wall Street bank, the senior loan officer made the exact same careless mistake. He saw my famous corporate brand name printed boldly on the equity transfer documents. He saw the massive billion-dollar valuation associated with my overall transportation empire. Blinded by the prospect of a massive year-end commission, he did not run a deep forensic audit on the specific subfolder of the shares she presented. Bankers are often just as greedy as the criminals they serve. He approved the collateral without a second thought. I sat in my dark study sipping black coffee and watching my computer monitor as the digital banking alerts flared to life. The massive loan was officially approved. The Wall Street Bank authorized the immediate disbursement of $5 million. Victoria walked out of the bank feeling like a god. The morning sun hit her face as she stepped onto the busy New York pavement. She thought she had outsmarted a veteran businessman. She thought she had successfully stolen my legacy to save her degenerate parents from the Russian mob. She thought she had beaten the old black man at his own game. My burner phone vibrated aggressively on my heavy wooden desk. I picked it up and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from Victoria. "The money is in my account. I own your legacy. Get ready to live under a bridge, old man." I read the message twice. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or anxiety. I felt a cold, deep, profound satisfaction. I slowly typed a response she would not understand until it was entirely too late. "Enjoy the crown, Victoria. It is much heavier than it looks." I placed the phone face down on my desk. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors illuminating my dark study. The $5 million had successfully landed in Victoria's personal holding account, but she was not planning to keep it there. She needed to wire that exact amount to a shadow bank in Cyprus to satisfy the ruthless Russian syndicate hunting her parents. She initiated the international wire transfer right there on the sidewalk outside the Wall Street Bank. I watched the digital progress bar on my tracking software load as she authorized the massive movement of funds. Her thumbs moved quickly across her phone screen, desperate to send the blood money and clear her family name. But the money did not go to Cyprus. The exact moment Victoria hit confirm on her banking application, a silent digital alarm was triggered deep inside the servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Weeks ago, when Jamal and I first discovered Victoria's connection to an international fraud ring, we did not just sit back and wait to be victimized. I reached out to a man named Marcus. Marcus and I had served together in Vietnam. We had bled together in the mud, and we had saved each other's lives more times than I can count. Today, Marcus was the regional director of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I had personally handed him the entire thick dossier on Victoria's parents and their massive outstanding debts to the Eastern European syndicate. Marcus had immediately placed a maximum security federal wiretap on every single bank account associated with Victoria's name. He was just waiting for her to make a significant financial move. As Victoria stood on the busy New York sidewalk waiting for the confirmation screen to appear, her banking application suddenly froze. The loading circle spun endlessly. Then a stark, dark red error message flashed across her screen. "Transaction denied. Account frozen by federal mandate." She stared at her phone. Her confident, arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. She frantically tapped the screen over and over again, trying to refresh the application. She tried to call her private banker, but the call went straight to an automated voicemail stating that the account was currently under strict federal review and all assets were locked. She had taken out a $5 million fraudulent loan using toxic, highly penalized corporate assets as collateral. She had attempted to wire that stolen money directly to a known international criminal syndicate. And she had done it all while the federal government was watching her every single keystroke. She thought she had won the war and secured her future. But she had just locked herself inside a federal prison cell. And the absolute best part of this entire beautiful situation was that the Russian mafia was still waiting for their money. The deadline was tonight. The syndicate did not care about frozen bank accounts or federal wiretaps or technical banking errors. They only cared about cold, hard cash. And Victoria had just completely run out of time to pay them. The panic set in exactly 42 minutes after the federal transaction failure. I watched the entire sequence of events unfold through the hidden surveillance feeds my private security team had tapped into. Victoria had retreated to the lavish hotel suite where her parents were hiding. She was pacing the floor like a trapped animal. Her white designer suit was wrinkled and her perfect hair was a mess. She kept staring at the banking application on her phone. The red error message was not just a temporary glitch. A formal notification from the Internal Revenue Service had just populated her inbox. The toxic chemical company she had so proudly claimed ownership of was not just drowning in environmental lawsuits. It was also the subject of a massive federal tax evasion probe. By using those specific shares as collateral, she had legally tied her own personal identity to a multi-million-dollar federal tax lien. The IRS does not play games. They had locked down every single penny she possessed. Then the heavy knock echoed through the hotel suite door. It was not room service. Through the hidden audio feed, I heard the door open. 2 men entered the room. They did not speak loudly. They did not need to. They were enforcers for the Eastern European syndicate. The Russian mafia had grown tired of waiting for their $10 million ransom. The men spoke in thick, heavy accents, delivering a very simple, terrifying message. They gave Victoria and her parents exactly 24 hours to produce the first $5 million. If the money was not in their offshore accounts by tomorrow night, they would not bother knocking next time. I listened to Beatrice sobbing hysterically. Richard was hyperventilating, begging for more time. Victoria was completely losing her mind. The brilliant manipulator who thought she could outsmart an old black business mogul was now backed into a deadly corner. She needed liquid assets immediately. The bank funds were frozen. The corporate shares were toxic. The only thing left that she believed she controlled was my physical property, my estate. She convinced herself that with the forged power of attorney documents, she could illegally evict me, stage a rapid cash sale of my multi-million-dollar mansion to a shady real estate developer, and hand the cash over to the Russians before the midnight deadline. But to do that, she needed me out of the house. Legally, an eviction takes months. She did not have months, she had hours. So she did what desperate criminals always do. She resorted to bribery. I sat in my dark study monitoring the live feeds as Victoria made a frantic phone call. She reached out to a man named Chief Harrison. Harrison was the head of the local municipal police department, a man known in quiet circles for making wealthy people's problems disappear for the right price. Victoria arranged a meeting in the desolate parking lot behind a closed shopping mall. My private investigator was already there, hiding in the shadows with a high-definition night vision lens. I watched the live video stream as Victoria handed Chief Harrison a thick leather briefcase. It contained $50,000 in untraceable cash. It was the absolute last of her emergency reserve funds. Harrison took the briefcase, checked the stacks of $100 bills, and nodded his head. He promised to send 2 of his most ruthless officers to my estate in the middle of the night to drag me out into the street under the false pretense of a bank foreclosure. I smiled in the darkness of my study. Victoria was digging her grave so deep she would never see the sunlight again. I did not call my lawyers. I did not call my security team. I simply prepared a pot of black coffee and waited in my favorite leather armchair. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the silence of my estate was violently shattered. Heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from my solid oak front door. Before I could even stand up, the door was kicked open with a deafening crash. Splinters of wood flew across my foyer. Heavy combat boots stomped onto my imported rugs. 2 uniformed police officers stormed into my living room. They had their hands resting intimidatingly on their duty belts. They were big, aggressive men used to terrorizing people who did not know their rights. They looked around the dimly lit room until their flashlights hit my face. I was sitting calmly in my chair, sipping my hot coffee. "Get up, old man." The first officer barked, his voice loud and echoing with unearned authority. "Put your shoes on and grab a coat. You are trespassing on foreclosed property. You have 5 minutes to vacate the premises before we arrest you for resisting a lawful order." The second officer stepped closer, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. They expected me to panic. They expected a confused, terrified senior citizen to beg for mercy or break down in tears. They thought their badges gave them absolute power in my home. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I placed the porcelain mug on the glass table. The clink of the ceramic was the only sound in the tense room. "I am not going anywhere," I said, my voice low and steady. "And neither are you until you see exactly whose orders you are following." The first officer sneered, taking a threatening step forward. "Listen to me, you crazy old fool. We are not playing games. We have official orders from the chief of police. This house belongs to the bank now. If you do not stand up right now, I will drag you out of here by your collar." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black remote control. I pointed it at the massive 85-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of my living room. I pressed a single button. The screen flashed brilliantly to life, illuminating the dark room with a stark blue light. The 2 officers froze, turning their heads to look at the massive display. The video playing on the screen was in crystal clear, high definition. It showed a desolate parking lot. It showed Victoria stepping out of a luxury sedan, and it showed Chief Harrison leaning against his unmarked police cruiser fully in uniform. The audio was flawless. The officers heard their boss demanding $50,000 to conduct an illegal midnight eviction. They watched in absolute silence as Victoria handed over the thick leather, vanished instantly. The color drained, vanished instantly. The color drained completely from their faces. The heavy, intimidating presence they brought into my home evaporated into pure, suffocating panic. They realized in a fraction of a second that they had walked directly into a massive federal trap. "Your chief is a very greedy man," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "And you two are very foolish men for doing his dirty work without asking questions." The first officer swallowed hard, dropping his hand away from his belt. "Sir," he stammered, his voice suddenly respectful and trembling, "we did not know. We were just following direct orders, following orders to break into the home of a retired logistics magnate in the middle of the night without a valid court warrant," I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "Following orders to enforce a fake foreclosure based on documents forged by an international fraud ring, currently under federal investigation. Tell me, officers, how exactly do you think this is going to look to the district attorney?" The second officer slowly backed away toward the front door, his eyes wide with fear. "Sir, we apologize," he said, his voice cracking. "We are leaving right now. This is a massive misunderstanding." "You are not leaving," I commanded, my voice rising with absolute authority. "You are going to stand right there, and you are going to call your corrupt chief. You are going to tell him that his little midnight raid failed completely." I stood up from my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, looking down at the two men who had tried to intimidate me. And then I continued, "You are going to tell him to look out his window because the Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently surrounding his house." As if on cue, the blue and red flashing lights of several unmarked federal vehicles illuminated the street outside my large window. The two officers looked outside and realized their entire careers, their freedom, and their lives were completely over. The Russian mafia was coming for Victoria, but the full weight of the United States government was coming for everyone who helped her. The board was cleared, and the final checkmate was rapidly approaching. Desperation is a very dangerous poison. It strips away all logic and leaves only raw, violent instinct. After her bribed police chief was raided by federal agents in the middle of the night, Victoria was completely out of options. The sun was rising, and her deadline with the Russian mafia was less than 12 hours away. Her bank accounts were frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. Her parents were marked for death. A rational person would have surrendered. But Victoria was not rational. She was a cornered predator, and a cornered predator always goes for the throat. I drove to the logistics corporate headquarters that morning. The towering glass building was a monument to 40 years of my blood and sweat. I took the private elevator up to the executive suite. Jamal was sitting behind his massive desk reviewing shipping manifests. We both knew Victoria was going to make a final desperate move, but we did not know what shape it would take. We did not have to wait long to find out. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung open. It was not our corporate partners or our board of directors. It was law enforcement. But these were not the corrupt local cops Victoria had hired the night before. These were serious men in sharp suits flanked by uniformed state troopers. They were financial crimes detectives. The lead detective marched straight into Jamal's office, holding up a thick stack of papers and a signed warrant. He did not ask questions. He did not ask for a meeting. He looked at my son with absolute professional coldness. "Jamal Vance, you are under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud," the detective announced, his voice booming across the silent office floor. I stood in the corner of the room, feeling the air get sucked out of my lungs. Embezzlement, wire fraud. It hit me instantly. Victoria had used her intimate access as his fiancée. She had lived in his apartment. She knew his passwords. She had spent the last few weeks secretly planting fabricated financial ledgers onto his personal servers. She had meticulously created a flawless paper trail, making it look like Jamal was siphoning millions of dollars from his own company to fund illegal offshore accounts. The sheer irony was sickening. She was taking her exact crimes and projecting them entirely onto my son. Jamal stood up from his desk. He did not shout. He did not resist. He played the part of the shocked and devastated executive flawlessly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, keeping his voice perfectly steady. "I have not stolen a single dime from this company." "Tell it to the judge," the detective said, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Put your hands behind your back." The metallic click of those handcuffs echoing in the pristine corporate office was the most terrible sound I have ever heard. No matter how much you plan a covert operation, no matter how many layers of strategy you build, seeing your black son put in police chains triggers a deep generational trauma that you cannot simply ignore. My hands curled into tight fists. Every fatherly instinct in my body screamed at me to step forward to tear the room apart to protect my boy. It took every ounce of discipline I had built over 72 years to stay frozen in my spot. The detectives marched Jamal out of his office. Dozens of my employees stood in the hallways watching in absolute stunned silence. The optics were a nightmare. A young, successful black chief executive officer being hauled out of his own building like a common street criminal. The whispers started immediately. As they pushed him toward the elevator doors, Jamal stopped for a fraction of a second. He looked back over his shoulder. He looked past the detectives and locked his eyes directly onto mine. His face was a mask of fear for the crowd, but in his eyes I saw absolute clarity. He gave me one single, almost invisible nod. It was the signal. This was the most dangerous gamble of our entire strategy. Jamal was intentionally walking into the belly of the beast. We knew Victoria would try to frame him to seize control of his assets, but by filing a false police report and submitting fabricated financial documents to state investigators, she had just crossed the line from civil fraud into massive federal felonies. She was handing the authorities the exact rope they needed to hang her. But Jamal had to sit in a jail cell for the trap to work. I followed them down to the lobby. I stood on the cold concrete pavement and watched the police push my son into the back of a squad car. The red and blue lights flashed aggressively against the glass building. The car pulled away into the city traffic, leaving me standing completely alone. I drove back to my empty estate. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink low on the horizon. The deadline for the Russian syndicate was approaching rapidly. The house was completely silent. I sat in my living room watching the clock on the wall tick away the minutes. I did not have to wait long. Just before sunset, the front door swung open. Victoria walked in without knocking. She looked absolutely deranged. Her expensive designer clothes were rumpled and stained with sweat. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess. Her eyes were bloodshot and wide with a manic, frantic energy. But despite her physical deterioration, she carried a twisted, victorious smirk on her face. She thought she had just delivered the ultimate killing blow. She marched straight into the living room and slammed a heavy set of keys onto my glass coffee table. I recognized the leather keychain instantly. They were the keys to Jamal's car. The police had given them to her because she had legally listed herself as his primary emergency contact. She stood over me, breathing heavily, staring down with pure toxic hatred. "Your precious boy is sitting in a concrete cell. Old man," she spat, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "He is facing 30 years for corporate fraud. The evidence I gave the police is absolutely flawless. They have IP addresses, they have offshore routing numbers, and they have his digital signatures. The state prosecutor is already preparing to deny his bail." I looked at the car keys on the table. I kept my face completely blank, showing her no emotion. "You framed him," I said quietly. "I survived," she snapped back, pacing the room like a rabid animal. "You forced my hand, you froze my accounts, you locked the trust, you left me with absolutely no choice. Since you love your company so much, I decided to let your son take the fall for bleeding it dry." She stopped pacing and leaned over the table, placing both hands on the glass. "Do you know what the justice system does to wealthy, arrogant black men who steal millions of dollars?" she whispered, weaponizing our race with a disgusting casual cruelty. "They do not get country club prisons, Desmond. They get buried. They make an example out of them. A jury is going to look at him and they are going to lock him in a cage until his hair turns as gray as yours." I did not flinch. "What do you want, Victoria?" "I want everything," she demanded, her voice rising to a frantic shout. "As his legally documented fiancé and his emergency proxy, I have the right to petition the court to manage his estate while he is incarcerated. But that takes too much time and I do not have time. The people I owe money to are coming tonight." She reached into her purse and pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents, throwing them next to the car keys. "You are going to unlock that blind trust right now," she ordered, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are going to transfer the remaining 70% of the company directly to me. If you sign those papers, I will call the prosecutor. I will tell them I found new evidence proving it was all a terrible digital misunderstanding. Jamal comes home tonight. And if I refuse, I asked, my voice dangerously low. She smiled a dark, empty smile. If you refuse, your son rots in federal prison for the rest of his life. I will let them destroy him. Sign the papers, old man. Buy your son's freedom. I looked at the car keys resting on the glass coffee table. I looked at the forged legal documents Victoria had violently thrown next to them. She stood there panting, her chest heaving with the toxic adrenaline of a woman who thought she had successfully cornered a wounded animal. She fully expected me to break down. She expected me to cry, for my son to beg for mercy, and to frantically sign away the remaining 70% of my life work just to keep Jamal out of a federal prison cell. Instead, I stopped leaning heavily against the edge of the sofa. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs completely. I straightened my spine, lifting myself to my full height of 6'2". I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the familiar rigid strength return to my muscles. The pathetic frailty I had been broadcasting for the last few days evaporated instantly into the thin air. The artificial trembling in my hands ceased completely. My eyes, which had been wide and confused just moments ago, narrowed into sharp, cold razors. Victoria took a slow, involuntary step backward. Her arrogant, victorious smirk faltered. The sudden physical transformation in my posture confused her. She was looking at a completely different man. I am done playing the victim, Victoria, I said. My voice was no longer the shaky whisper of a senile old man. It was a low, terrifying rumble. It was the voice I used to break labor strikes in the 1980s. It was the voice I used to force ruthless Wall Street bankers to back down from hostile takeovers. You wanted to see the man who built a billion-dollar empire from the mud. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. You wanted to see the monster who survived the jungles of Vietnam and the brutal racist boardrooms of corporate America. Well, here I am. Take a very good look. What are you doing? She stammered, trying to maintain her aggressive facade, but her voice was betraying her rising panic. Sign the papers, Desmond. Your son is in a cage right now. Do you not care about him? Jamal is exactly where he needs to be, I replied smoothly. He walked into that police station willingly. He let them put those handcuffs on him specifically to keep your eyes looking in the absolute wrong direction. You thought you were framing him. You had no idea he was giving us the perfect distraction to completely dismantle your entire bloodline. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a way to process the catastrophic failure of her master plan. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. You have nothing left. Your accounts are frozen. Your lawyer sold you out. You are totally isolated. I reached across the mahogany side table and picked up my secure satellite phone. I did not dial a lawyer. I did not dial a local police station. I dialed Marcus, the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My old brother in arms. The line connected immediately on the first ring. It is time, Marcus, I said, speaking clearly into the receiver. Operation Trash Removal begins right now. Bring the hammer down. Consider it done, Desmond Marcus replied, his deep voice echoing slightly through the speaker. We are moving on all targets simultaneously. I ended the call and placed the phone gently back onto the table. Victoria was breathing rapidly now. The polished, sophisticated con artist was completely deteriorating right in front of my eyes. Who was that? She whispered, her face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. What did you just do? I just unlocked my real blind trust, I explained, pacing slowly around her like a predator circling a wounded deer. You thought my trust was just a simple vault holding my personal cash. You thought locking my corporate credit card meant you had cut off my financial oxygen. But a true blind trust at my level of wealth is not a vault, Victoria. It is a living, breathing financial weapon. And I just took the safety completely off. She shook her head violently, refusing to believe the nightmare that was unfolding. No, you cannot do anything. The federal government froze your assets when you signed that toxic subsidiary over to me. I laughed, a dark, humorless sound that chilled the room. They did not freeze my assets, Victoria. They froze your assets because you claimed ownership of the toxic waste. My real wealth is completely insulated in holding companies you cannot even pronounce. And for the last 48 hours, while you were busy trying to bribe local police chiefs and forge medical documents, my financial hitmen have been extremely busy. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of her, forcing her to look up into my eyes. We did not just freeze your parents' bank accounts, Victoria, I said, delivering the killing blow. My holding companies actively swooped in and acquired their debts. We bought the underwater mortgages on those fake luxury properties they hid under shell companies in Eastern Europe. And most importantly, we bought the $10 million marker the Russian syndicate put on their heads. Victoria's knees actually buckled. She had to grab the edge of the sofa to keep from collapsing onto the floor. "No," she gasped, her eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. "No, that is impossible. You cannot buy mafia debt. You do not have that kind of leverage." "I have resources you cannot even begin to comprehend, little girl," I whispered coldly. "The Russian syndicate cares about one thing and one thing only: cash. When my offshore accounts offered them an immediate buyout of your parents' debt with a 20% premium, they gladly transferred the collection rights directly to me." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. She was finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. "The mafia does not own your parents anymore, Victoria," I said, leaning in close so she could hear every single devastating syllable. "I do. I own their houses. I own their bank accounts. I own their freedom. And right now my acquisition teams alongside federal agents are tearing down every single asset your family has ever claimed to possess." Right on cue, the heavy silence in the living room was shattered by a loud, aggressive, vibrating sound. It was coming from Victoria's expensive designer purse. Her cell phone was ringing frantically. She lunged for her bag, her hands shaking so violently she could barely operate the zipper. She pulled out the phone and swiped the screen, putting the call on speakerphone to prove to herself that I was lying. She desperately needed to hear that her parents were safe, but the voice that came blasting through the tiny speaker was not calm or safe. It was her father, Richard, screaming in absolute primal terror. "Victoria, what is happening?" Richard roared over the phone. The background noise was chaotic. I could hear the sound of heavy wood splintering and glass shattering. "Dad, what is wrong?" Victoria cried, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her perfect makeup. "The debt collectors are breaking down the front doors," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Federal agents are swarming the property. They are confiscating the cars right out of the driveway. The bank just sent a notice that they foreclosed on the hotel suite, and all our overseas accounts have been permanently seized." Beatrice, her mother, was sobbing hysterically in the background, shouting that men in dark suits were carrying away their luggage and seizing their passports. "Victoria, please tell me you wired the $5 million, Richard begged, his voice reducing to a pathetic whimper. "They are taking everything, Victoria. They said our debt was sold to an American logistics firm. Who the hell did you mess with?" Victoria slowly lowered the phone. She did not answer her father. She just stared at me, her hands trembling, her entire world burning to the ground in real time. I stood there tall and perfectly composed. I looked at the broken woman who had confidently demanded $5 million at my Sunday dinner table, who had thrown wine in my face, and who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. "Tell him exactly who you messed with, Victoria," I said, my voice dead and emotionless. "Tell him you tried to steal from Desmond Vance." The phone slipped from Victoria's trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud, cutting off her father's frantic screaming. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy and suffocating. She stood completely still for 10 agonizing seconds. I could literally see the gears in her mind grinding, breaking, and shattering as the absolute reality of her destruction washed over her. She had played the ultimate game of deception, and she had lost everything. Then something inside her completely snapped. The polished, sophisticated European aristocrat vanished. The calculating corporate manipulator was gone. What remained was a feral, desperate animal trapped in a cage of her own making. She let out a guttural, high-pitched scream that sounded like tearing metal. She lunged toward the expensive crystal vase sitting on the entryway table. She grabbed it with both hands and hurled it directly at my head. I simply tilted my body to the right. The heavy crystal flew past my shoulder and smashed into a million glittering pieces against the stone fireplace. She did not stop. She grabbed a heavy bronze lamp from the side table and ripped it from the wall socket, violently tearing the cord. She smashed it into the glass coffee table, shattering the thick pane into jagged shards. She was destroying my living room, trying to inflict any kind of damage she could on the man who had just dismantled her entire life. I stood perfectly still with my hands clasped loosely behind my back. I did not yell for her to stop. I did not call for help. I just watched her tear her own sanity to pieces, "You ruined me!" she shrieked, grabbing a stack of hardback books and throwing them blindly across the room. "You ruined my family, you old miserable bastard! What did you do? What did you do to us?" She turned frantically toward the open marble kitchen adjacent to the living room. Her wild eyes scanned the granite countertops. She spotted a sharp silver paring knife resting near a bowl of fruit. She lunged for it, gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She spun around, pointing the blade directly at my chest. Her chest heaved. Her perfect blonde hair was plastered to her sweaty forehead. "I am going to kill you," she hissed, taking a slow, predatory step toward me. "I am going to cut you open and watch you bleed out on your expensive rugs. Then I am going to make Jamal sign everything over to me before the police even find your body." She genuinely thought she was intimidating. She thought a piece of kitchen cutlery would make me drop to my knees and beg for my life. She clearly did not know the history of the man she was trying to murder. When you build a trucking empire in the 1970s as a black man, you do not just sit in an air-conditioned office. You ride in the cabs. You load the freight. You defend your cargo. I have fought off armed hijackers on dark desert highways. I have been cornered by corrupt union enforcers wielding steel pipes and baseball bats. I have looked down the barrel of a loaded shotgun held by men who wanted me dead simply because of the color of my skin. A 30-year-old scam artist with a fruit knife was moving in slow motion to me. She charged. She raised the knife, aiming straight for my heart, screaming at the top of her lungs. I did not panic. I simply pivoted my right foot, shifting my entire body weight to the side just as the blade thrust forward. She missed my chest by 4 inches, stumbling forward, carried by her own reckless momentum. As she passed me, I brought my left hand up in a swift, brutal motion. I struck her wrist perfectly, hitting the nerve center with the hard edge of my palm. Her fingers spasmed, instantly releasing the handle. The silver knife flew from her grip and plunged deeply into the solid oak dining table, quivering as it embedded itself into the wood. Before she could recover her balance, I grabbed her by the shoulder, twisted her around, and shoved her hard. She stumbled and fell to her knees, her hands slapping against the hardwood floor. "Do not ever raise a weapon to me in my own house," I said, my voice echoing like thunder in the large room. She scrambled, trying to get back on her feet, her eyes darting toward the knife stuck in the table. But before she could even stand up, the shadows of my house suddenly moved. I did not need to call the police. I did not need to press a panic button. From the dark hallway leading to the guest bedrooms, 3 massive men stepped into the light. They were dressed in full tactical black, wearing silent combat boots and carrying encrypted radios. They were not standard security guards. They were elite private military contractors, highly trained operators I had hired the moment Jamal told me about Victoria's background. They had been inside my house since yesterday, completely hidden, waiting silently in the empty rooms for my specific command or for Victoria to cross the line into physical violence. She just crossed it. The lead operator moved with terrifying speed. Before Victoria could even scream, he grabbed her arms, twisting them firmly but professionally behind her back. He drove his knee into the floor, bringing her down completely. She hit the hardwood with a loud grunt. The second operator immediately secured her legs while the third stood guard, scanning the room. "Get off me!" she shrieked, thrashing wildly against the heavy hands pinning her down. "Get your filthy hands off me. You cannot do this. I am going to sue you, too. I am going to have you all arrested." The operators did not say a single word. They did not even look at her. They looked at me, waiting for instructions. "Hold her there," I said calmly, walking over to the oak table and yanking the silver knife out of the wood. I tossed it carelessly into the kitchen sink. Victoria was hyperventilating, her cheek pressed hard against the cold floor. She was completely immobilized, surrounded by broken glass and shattered crystal. The elegant, sophisticated woman who had demanded $5 million at my dining table was now writhing on the ground like a captured snake. "You are going to prison, Victoria," I said, looking down at her. "Assault with a deadly weapon. Attempted murder. And that is just the local charges. The federal agents taking apart your parents' overseas accounts right now are going to bury you under a mountain of financial fraud charges. You are never going to see the sun as a free woman again." She stopped struggling. Her breathing slowed down into ragged, desperate gasps. She looked up at me from the floor, her blonde hair covering half her face. And then slowly a dark, twisted laugh bubbled up from her throat. It grew louder, echoing crazily in the ruined living room. "You think you won?" She laughed, spitting a strand of hair out of her mouth. "You think you are so smart, Desmond. You think freezing my bank accounts and buying my parents' debt means you beat me?" I stared at her, analyzing the sudden shift in her tone. The panic was gone, replaced by a venomous, spiteful arrogance. "I told you, old man," she smiled, her eyes wide and manic. "I needed that $5 million today. When the bank froze my accounts this morning, I did not just sit in my hotel room and cry. I knew the mafia was coming. I knew I had to liquidate assets immediately. I needed untraceable cash, and I needed it fast." She shifted her head against the floor, maintaining absolute eye contact with me. "Those 30% core equity shares Jamal transferred to me," she whispered, her voice dripping with poison. "The ones you think are safely locked away. I did not keep them, Desmond. I knew I could not borrow against them fast enough with the feds watching, so I sold them." I kept my expression blank, but a deep, cold tension gripped my chest. "You sold restricted corporate shares in less than 6 hours, I asked, my tone flat. "That is legally impossible without board approval. Nothing is impossible when you are selling gold for pennies." She laughed hysterically. "I did not go to a standard broker, Desmond. I went directly to your biggest rival. I went to the CEO of Apex Global Logistics. I walked into his office this afternoon and I offered him 30% of your company for $10 million in cold, hard, liquid cash." Apex Global Logistics was a massive, ruthless corporate conglomerate. They had been trying to launch a hostile takeover of my company for the last 10 years. "They hated me, and I despised them. He signed the papers 30 minutes ago," she sneered, her voice rising with triumphant glee. "The cash is currently being routed through a decentralized crypto exchange straight to the Russians. You did not just lose your equity, Desmond. You handed the absolute keys to your castle directly to your worst enemy." She laughed again, a loud, chaotic sound that filled the room. "You wanted a war, old man. Well, congratulations. The wolves are already inside the walls. Let us see how you fight your way out of this one." I looked down at the crazy woman pinned to my floor. She thought she had dropped the ultimate atomic bomb on my legacy. She thought selling out to Apex Global was her masterstroke of brilliant revenge. She had absolutely no idea what she had actually done. I did not frown. I did not show anger. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my vibrating phone, preparing for the next brutal phase of my operation. Victoria's manic laughter was still echoing off the high ceilings of my shattered living room when the crunch of heavy tires on gravel interrupted her. Headlights swept through the large front windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the broken crystal and overturned furniture. Someone else had arrived. I looked down at the woman pinned to my floor. Her triumphant smile was plastered across her sweaty face. She genuinely thought her white knight had come to deliver the final blow to my legacy. "Let her up," I told the security operators calmly. The 3 massive men stepped back, releasing their grip on her arms and legs. Victoria scrambled to her feet, rubbing her sore wrists. She smoothed down her ruined designer suit and lifted her chin, looking toward the front door with absolute, arrogant pride. Through the open doorway walked Maxwell Thorne. Maxwell was the chief executive officer of Apex Global Logistics. He was a ruthless third-generation corporate raider who had inherited his wealth and spent his entire career trying to crush self-made men like me. For 10 years, he had tried to launch hostile takeovers against my company. For 10 years, I had beaten him in every single boardroom, every single contract bid, and every single territorial dispute. He hated me with a passion that burned hot and bright. Walking right behind Maxwell was his chief legal counsel, a short, balding man clutching a thick leather portfolio. Maxwell stepped into my living room, completely ignoring the broken glass crunching beneath his expensive Italian loafers. He looked at the armed security operators, then looked at Victoria, and finally locked his cold blue eyes directly onto me. A smug, satisfied smile spread across his face. "Good evening, Desmond," Maxwell said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I apologize for the late intrusion, but corporate restructuring waits for no man." He walked further into the room, acting as if he already owned the title to the property. I have to admit, Desmond Maxwell continued looking around the room with fake sympathy. "I always thought our final battle would be fought in a courtroom or a shareholder meeting. I never imagined you would be undone by your own future daughter-in-law." Victoria here was incredibly highly motivated to sell. She practically begged my acquisition team to take those 30% core equity shares off her hands. $10 million in liquid, untraceable cryptocurrency is a steep price for a midnight deal, but to finally break your iron grip on the East Coast shipping lanes, it was an absolute bargain. Victoria stood taller, moving closer to Maxwell as if seeking his protection. She crossed her arms and glared at me. "I told you, old man," she spat. "You cannot beat me. You lost everything. Now tell your hired thugs to leave before Mr. Thorne has you arrested for trespassing in his new corporate asset." I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the panic they both desperately wanted to see. I simply walked over to my heavy mahogany desk, stepping carefully over the ruined lamp cord. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a single red folder. "Maxwell," I said, keeping my tone conversational and light. "You have always been a very impatient man. Your father built Apex Logistics by being thorough, but you always rushed to the finish line just to prove how smart you were." Maxwell scoffed, waving his hand. "Save the lectures, Desmond. You are outvoted. With Victoria's 30% and the shadow proxies my firm already acquired, we now hold the controlling majority of your parent company. You are officially terminated as chairman. Pack your bags." I opened the red folder and pulled out the original unredacted corporate charter for the exact shares Victoria had sold him. "Tell me, Maxwell," I asked, taking a slow step toward him. "Did your legal team conduct a full forensic audit on the specific subfolder of those shares before you wired $10 million to an anonymous crypto wallet? Or did you just see my company logo on the transfer papers and blindly sign the deal because you were so desperate to finally beat me?" The smug smile on Maxwell's face flickered for a fraction of a second. He glanced back at his lawyer, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. "The shares are legally binding," Maxwell snapped defensively. "We verified the electronic signatures. They grant 30% voting equity in the Vance Logistics enterprise." I held the thick document out to him. "Take a closer look, Maxwell. Look at the exact classification of the equity class." Maxwell hesitated, then snatched the document from my hand. He opened it and his eyes darted across the dense legal paragraphs. His lawyer stepped up beside him, peering over his shoulder. The room was dead silent except for the rustling of the heavy paper. As they read, the color began to rapidly drain from the lawyer's face. He let out a sharp, terrified gasp. He pointed a trembling finger at a specific clause near the bottom of the second page. "Mr. Thorne," the lawyer whispered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "These are not Class A voting shares for the main fleet. These are Class C restricted shares. They belong entirely to the Rust Belt Chemical Transport subsidiary." Maxwell's brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What does that mean?" "What chemical subsidiary?" I smiled, feeling a cold, profound satisfaction wash over my entire body. "It means, Maxwell," I said, projecting my voice so every single word hit him like a physical blow, "that 5 years ago I bought a completely dead, bankrupt chemical transport company. That company owns highly contaminated land that is currently the sole target of a $50 million environmental cleanup mandate enforced directly by the federal government. I kept that company alive on paper and buried it deep inside my corporate structure as a poison pill, a lethal trap designed specifically for arrogant corporate raiders who try to steal my company from the inside out." Maxwell's hands began to shake, holding the document. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. "By legally purchasing those exact shares from Victoria tonight, I continued twisting the knife deeper. You did not buy a controlling interest in my logistics fleet. You just legally absorbed 100% of the liability for a $50 million federal toxic waste dump. My company is completely insulated. Yours is now directly on the hook with the Environmental Protection Agency. You just poisoned your own billion-dollar conglomerate." The lawyer snatched the paper from Maxwell's hands, flipping frantically through the remaining pages. "He is right, Mr. Thorne," the lawyer cried out, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The liability transfer is absolute. Because we bypassed the standard due diligence waiting period to secure the midnight purchase, we waived our right to contest the environmental debt. We are legally responsible for $50 million in federal fines effective immediately." Maxwell Thorne stood completely frozen. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire had just walked straight into a wood chipper. He slowly turned his head and looked at Victoria. The victorious smirk had vanished from Victoria's face. Her eyes were wide with pure, paralyzing terror. She took a step back, raising her hands defensively. I did not know, she stammered, her voice shrinking into a pathetic squeak. "I swear I did not know. Jamal just gave me the papers. I thought they were the main shares." Maxwell lunged forward, grabbing Victoria by the collar of her expensive white suit. "You stupid, fraudulent piece of trash!" Maxwell roared, his face turning purple with unimaginable rage. You sold me toxic federal debt. You took $10 million of my liquid capital and strapped a $50 million bomb to my chest. Get your hands off me, Victoria screamed, struggling to break free from his aggressive grip. The money is gone. I already wired it to Europe. I had to pay my parents' debts. You wired it to Europe, Maxwell screamed, shaking her violently. I am going to bury you. I am going to hire every single vicious litigator on the East Coast, and I am going to sue you for criminal misrepresentation, grand larceny, and corporate sabotage. I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a federal penitentiary. He shoved her away with so much force that she stumbled backward and collapsed hard onto the hardwood floor, cutting her knees on the shattered crystal glass. Maxwell turned back to me, his chest heaving, his fists clenched in pure, helpless fury. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. He had lost everything, and he knew it. He spun around and stormed out of the house, his panicked lawyer trailing closely behind him. The sound of his luxury car speeding recklessly down the driveway echoed into the night. The living room fell silent once again. The 3 security operators stood like statues in the shadows. Victoria was left sitting alone on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of my living room and the complete destruction of her entire life. She had no money. The $10 million she stole from Maxwell was already routed to the Russian mafia. But the mafia was still going to kill her parents because her original accounts were frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was coming for her regarding the forged medical documents. And now an angry billionaire was going to unleash an army of lawyers to destroy whatever was left of her existence. She looked up at me. The arrogant, entitled scam artist was completely gone. Her mask had been permanently ripped away, leaving only a terrified, broken little girl who had played a game far above her weight class. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Blood trickled from a small cut on her knee where the glass had bitten into her skin. She slowly crawled forward across the floor, pulling herself toward my feet. She reached out with trembling hands and gently grabbed the cuffs of my trousers. "Please," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate wail. "Please, Desmond, I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was stupid. I was just trying to save my mother and father. Please, you have the power to stop this. You can tell the feds to back off. You can fix the corporate shares. Please, I am begging you. Save me." I looked down at the woman who had thrown wine in my face, who had called me a senile old fool, who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward so she could steal the empire I built with my own blood. I did not kick her away. I did not yell. I simply looked at her with eyes as cold as a frozen grave. "I told you at the dinner table, Victoria," I whispered softly. Trust locked. Before she could let out another agonizing scream, the heavy oak front door slowly pushed open. Heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. The final piece of the master plan had just arrived. The heavy oak front door slowly pushed open. The sound of solid, confident footsteps echoed through the grand foyer. Victoria scrambled backward on the floor, her tear-streaked face turning toward the dark hallway. She expected to see more federal agents. She expected to see local police arriving to drag me away. She did not expect the man who walked into the ruined living room. Jamal stepped into the light. He was not wearing an orange prison jumpsuit. He was not wearing handcuffs. He was dressed in an impeccable charcoal gray tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep blue silk tie. He looked every inch the powerful chief executive officer of a billion-dollar logistics empire. He stood tall, his shoulders broad, his expression completely devoid of any emotion. Victoria stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She looked at his wrists frantically, searching for the steel chains she had gleefully envisioned just hours ago. There were none. He rubbed his wrists, slowly adjusting his expensive cufflinks with absolute calm. "Jamal," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute shock. "How are you here? The state prosecutor denied your bail. I gave the detectives the offshore routing numbers. I gave them the IP addresses. I saw them arrest you." Jamal walked slowly past the 3 armed security operators. He stepped gracefully over the shattered crystal vase and the ruined bronze lamp. He looked down at the woman he had asked to marry him. There was no love in his eyes. There was no warmth. There was only the cold, sterile look of a man inspecting a piece of garbage on his shoe. You gave them exactly what I wanted you to give them, Jamal said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. You thought you were secretly planting fabricated financial ledgers onto my personal servers. You thought I was sleeping while you were typing away on your laptop in my bed. You had no idea that my cybersecurity team had cordoned off a fake server farm specifically for you to play in. We watched you build the fake paper trail for weeks, Victoria. We logged every single keystroke you made. We tracked every single fraudulent document you created. She shook her head violently, refusing to process the magnitude of her failure. No, she stammered, crawling slightly backward across the hardwood. The detectives arrested you. I saw them drag you out of the corporate building. The whole company saw it. They did arrest me, Jamal replied smoothly, crossing his arms over his chest. Because that was the absolute only way to get me into the federal building through the back door without your criminal associates noticing. I did not sit in a dirty holding cell, Victoria. I sat in a highly secure conference room with the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He took a slow, deliberate step closer to her. I handed them the decrypted master drives. Jamal continued, his tone flat and merciless. I gave them the names of the shadow banks in Cyprus. I gave them the encrypted communication logs between your degenerate parents and the Russian syndicate. I traded your entire international money laundering network in exchange for full corporate immunity and a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. Victoria let out a soft, pathetic whimper. The realization hit her with the brutal force of a falling anvil. She had never been the puppet master. She had been the puppet from the very first day she walked into our lives. Every smile, every kiss, every late-night conversation was nothing but a calculated counterintelligence operation run by the man she thought she was manipulating. Jamal reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a small, black velvet box. He flipped it open with his thumb. Inside rested the flawless 4-carat diamond engagement ring he had placed on her finger 8 months ago. He looked at the diamond shining in the dim light of the living room. Then he looked back down at Victoria. The act is officially over, Victoria, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. 5 months. 5 agonizing months of playing a weak, spineless man manipulated by your toxic greed. 5 months of biting my tongue while you disrespected my father in his own house. I had to pretend to be a pathetic fool just to map out your criminal network. It was the most disgusting 5 months of my entire life. He turned his hand over. The heavy diamond ring fell from the velvet box. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clink, bouncing twice before coming to rest right next to Victoria's bleeding knee. Keep the ring, Jamal said coldly, looking at her with pure disgust. You can use it to pay the commissary when you get to federal prison. Victoria stared at the diamond. It was the symbol of her ultimate con, now reduced to a piece of useless metal on a ruined floor. She had lost the $5 million. She had lost the corporate shares to our biggest rival. She had lost her parents to the violent debt collectors. And now she had lost the final illusion that she was smarter than the 2 black men standing above her. She stayed completely silent for a long, heavy minute. The frantic sobbing stopped. The pathetic begging ceased. A terrifying, unnatural calm washed over her face. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, ignoring the sharp pain in her cut knees. She stood up, smoothing down her ruined white designer suit one last time. When she finally looked at us, the desperate, frightened animal was gone. What replaced it was a cold, calculating monster with absolutely nothing left to lose. You think this ends with a neat little federal bow? She asked, her voice eerily quiet and perfectly composed. You think you can just hand a flash drive to the authorities and walk away clean? You are going to prison, Victoria, I said, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with my son. The game is over. The legal game might be over. She smiled, a twisted, wicked grin spreading across her pale face. But the public game has not even started yet. She reached into her ruined purse and pulled out her cell phone. It was completely intact. The screen was glowing brightly. Do you know what the media loves more than a corporate fraud scandal? She asked, her eyes gleaming with pure toxic malice. They love a victim, and they absolutely adore a vulnerable, fragile white woman being terrorized by wealthy, aggressive black men. Jamal tensed beside me. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice hard. I am talking about the narrative, Jamal. She laughed softly, holding her phone up like a weapon. I am going to walk out of this house, and before the federal agents even finish drafting my arrest warrant, I am going to every major news network in the country. I am going to sit in front of the cameras with my torn clothes and my bleeding knees. I am going to cry perfectly calibrated tears. I am going to tell the world that the powerful, intimidating chief executive officer of Vance Logistics and his ruthless father physically assaulted me, held me hostage, and forced me to sign away my legal rights. You have absolutely no proof, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The federal government has the real evidence. They know exactly who you are. I do not need proof, old man, she spat, her voice rising with manic, dangerous energy. We live in a society that convicts in the court of public opinion. I just need tears. I just need to play the frightened damsel in distress. The public will eat it up. The stock market will panic immediately. The board of directors will force Jamal to resign before the truth even makes it to a courtroom. She took a step back toward the hallway, pointing her finger at us. I am going to paint you both as violent, predatory monsters who use their billions to bully and abuse innocent women, Victoria shouted, her eyes wide and completely unhinged. I will tank your entire empire before the sun comes up. I will incite a racial and social mob so loud the federal government will have to drop my charges just to appease the angry masses. You wanted to ruin my life. I am going to make sure the entire world watches your legacy burn to the absolute ground. She turned around and sprinted toward the front door, her high heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. She was running to ignite the ultimate toxic fire. She was running to weaponize society itself against us. The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving Jamal and me in the silent left. I told my security operators to left. I told my security operators to clean up the shattered glass and secure the perimeter. Jamal and I did not sleep that night. We sat in my study watching the digital world bracing for the impact of her final desperate weapon. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the internet was completely ablaze. Victoria did not go to a police station. She did not go to a hospital. She went straight to the court of public opinion. She launched a live video broadcast from the back seat of a moving car, supposedly fleeing for her life. Jamal and I watched the stream on the large monitor in my study. Her performance was an absolute masterclass in manipulative sociopathy. She had intentionally smeared her makeup to look like she had been crying for hours. She made sure the camera clearly showed the torn fabric of her expensive designer suit and the dried blood on her knee from where she had collapsed onto the shattered crystal in my living room. She looked directly into the lens, trembling violently, playing the ultimate role of the helpless victim. She told her millions of viewers a horrifying, fabricated story. She claimed that Jamal and I were violent, predatory monsters. She wept as she described how we lured her to my isolated estate, locked the doors, and physically assaulted her. She told the world that we forced her to sign away her corporate equity under the threat of death. She completely weaponized her tears, exploiting every single racial and social bias built into the fabric of this country. She painted us as wealthy, aggressive black men, using our billionaire status to abuse and silence a fragile, innocent white woman. The public reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Within 2 hours, the video had 20 million views. The outrage was a tidal wave. Social media influencers, journalists, and politicians immediately jumped on the bandwagon, condemning us without asking for a single shred of actual evidence. They called for our immediate arrests. They called for boycotts. They demanded justice for Victoria. At 9:30 in the morning, the stock market officially opened. The impact on Vance Logistics was catastrophic. I sat in the executive boardroom at the corporate headquarters with Jamal and our terrified board of directors. We watched the massive digital ticker on the wall glow bright red. Our company stock was in a terrifying free fall. We lost hundreds of millions of dollars in market valuation in less than 45 minutes. Corporate sponsors were calling frantically, threatening to pull their contracts. Freight partners were suspending their shipping agreements. The media had surrounded our building with news vans and aggressive reporters. A senior board member, a man who had worked with me for 20 years, stood up, his hands shaking. "Desmond," he said, his voice frantic, "we have to issue a public apology immediately. Jamal needs to step down as chief executive officer pending an internal investigation. We have to hire a crisis management firm to spin this narrative before the company goes completely bankrupt." I looked at the panicked executives sitting around my long mahogany table. They were ready to surrender the empire I built just to appease an angry internet mob. "Nobody is stepping down," I said, my voice echoing through the large room with absolute bone-chilling authority. And we are absolutely not issuing an apology. An apology implies guilt. We do not defend ourselves against a rabid dog. We put it down. I turned to Jamal. He was perfectly calm, sitting tall in his executive chair. He knew exactly what I was about to do. "Get me the head of our corporate media acquisitions," I ordered. "I want to buy airtime." The board members looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Desmond, you cannot launch a public relations campaign right now," one of them pleaded. "The public hates us. Any commercial we put out will just provoke them more." "I am not putting out a commercial," I replied, standing up from the table. "I am dropping a nuclear bomb." I did not hire a public relations firm to carefully craft a polite defensive statement. I used my massive liquid wealth to do something entirely unprecedented. I contacted the advertising executives at every single major national news network: CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the major broadcast channels. I bypassed all standard protocols by offering them triple the premium rate paid entirely in cash. I bought out a full 3-minute uninterrupted commercial slot across every single network. I bought the exact same time slot. 8:00 in the evening. Prime time. The exact moment when the entire country would be sitting in their living rooms, watching the evening news, waiting for updates on the massive corporate scandal Victoria had just ignited. For the rest of the day, Jamal and I ignored the plunging stock prices. We ignored the journalists screaming outside the glass doors. We ignored the thousands of death threats pouring into our corporate email servers. We sat in the server room with our top audio engineers preparing the absolute destruction of Victoria's public image. At 7:59 that evening, the country was glued to their televisions. News anchors were delivering passionate monologues about the tragic abuse Victoria had allegedly suffered at our hands. They were painting her as a brave survivor speaking truth to power. Then the clock struck 8. Across every major network, the news broadcasts abruptly cut to commercial break, but there were no advertisements for cars or pharmaceutical drugs. The screens across tens of millions of American televisions went completely pitch black. There was no video, there was no corporate logo, there was only crisp, clear, undeniable audio. It was the high-definition recording captured by the hidden microphones in my living room and hallway. The entire nation sitting in their living room suddenly heard Victoria's voice. But it was not the weeping, trembling voice of the fragile victim they had seen on social media that morning. It was the cold, calculating, arrogant voice of a ruthless predator. "I want him out of that house today." Victoria's voice echoed through millions of television speakers, her tone dripping with pure greed and malice. "I want him desperate." The screen remained black, but stark white subtitles appeared, syncing perfectly with her recorded words. The entire country listened in stunned silence as the recording played the conversation between Victoria and the corrupt Dr. Eris. They heard her gleefully plotting to throw a sane elderly man into a locked psychiatric ward. They heard her explicit instructions to forge my medical documents and strip me of my legal rights. Then the audio seamlessly transitioned to the explosive argument in my living room. They heard her screaming about her $10 million debt to the Russian mafia. They heard her admit to stealing my corporate equity. They heard the pure venom in her voice as she laughed about taking my money to save her degenerate parents from an international criminal syndicate. For 3 agonizing, undeniable minutes, the American public was forced to listen to the absolute truth. There was no spin. There was no context missing. It was the raw, unedited sound of a sociopathic scam artist destroying her own carefully constructed narrative. At the very end of the broadcast, the black screen finally changed. A single legal document appeared on the screen. It was the official federal indictment from the Federal Bureau of Investigation detailing the massive money laundering ring operated by Victoria's parents. The broadcast ended. The regular news programming returned. The news anchors who had just spent the last 12 hours defending her were left sitting at their desks completely speechless, staring blankly into their cameras. The silence lasted for about 3 minutes, and then the entire world flipped upside down. The backlash was biblical. The internet, which had been calling for my head just moments ago, turned on Victoria with a ferocious, terrifying vengeance. The hashtags demanding justice for her were instantly replaced by viral trends exposing her as a fraud. People realized they had been played. They had been emotionally manipulated by a masterful con artist, and the public hates nothing more than being made to look like fools. By 9 o'clock, the stock market futures for Vance Logistics began to skyrocket. Investors who had dumped our stock in a panic realized that the company was not run by criminals, but by men smart enough to trap an international fraud syndicate. Our valuation rebounded, erasing the morning's losses and climbing even higher. But the media destruction was only the beginning. The television broadcast acted like a global flare fired into the dark night sky. When Victoria's real voice and true identity were broadcast across the nation, the dam finally broke. The exposure was so massive that it reached people outside of our immediate circle. The FBI tip lines were absolutely flooded. The broadcast triggered a massive chain reaction that neither Jamal nor I could have fully predicted. Families from California to New York started calling the authorities. A wealthy widower in Chicago recognized Victoria's voice as the woman who had scammed his brother out of his life savings 3 years ago. A prominent real estate family in London recognized her parents from the federal documents shown on screen, identifying them as the architects of a massive investment fraud that ruined their estate. Victoria was no longer just a greedy fiancée trying to steal a logistics company. She was officially identified as the linchpin of a sprawling, highly organized international criminal network that had been operating in the shadows for a decade. Before midnight, the federal prosecutor upgraded her charges from simple wire fraud to racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. A federal judge immediately signed a nationwide arrest warrant. Her face was plastered across every single news channel, but this time she was not the victim. She was public enemy number one. Jamal and I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his executive office, looking out over the glittering city lights. My phone vibrated with a message from Marcus, the regional FBI director. "We have tactical teams deployed at every airport, train station, and border crossing," Marcus wrote. "We are closing the net." The media had been completely weaponized against her. She had tried to burn our legacy to the ground, but she had only succeeded in illuminating her own horrific crimes for the entire world to see. She had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The final hunt had officially begun. The digital clock on the wall of my study read 2 in the morning. We had just dropped a media bomb that shattered Victoria's entire world. But the fallout was still raining down. My secure phone buzzed. It was Marcus. He had a federal wiretap on a private aviation broker operating out of a small, unregulated airstrip in New Jersey. Richard and Beatrice were making a run for it. They had scraped together whatever hidden cash they had left and booked a one-way charter flight. They were heading to a country with absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. They were leaving their mess behind. They were running from the Russian mafia and the federal government. Marcus told me his tactical team was mobilizing. I told him Jamal and I were coming with them. I needed to see this end with my own 2 eyes. The ride in the back of the armored Federal Command vehicle was incredibly tense. Jamal sat next to me, checking the live tracking feeds on his encrypted tablet. The convoy of unmarked black sport utility vehicles tore down the empty highway. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark trees. We were racing against the clock. If that plane lifted off the tarmac, they would vanish into international airspace. The syndicate would probably find them before the authorities ever did. We breached the perimeter of the private airfield just as the twin engines of the luxury jet began to spool up. The high-pitched whine of the turbines cut through the cold night air. They were literally minutes away from takeoff. The federal convoy did not bother checking in with the tower. The lead vehicle smashed right through the chain-link security gate. Federal agents jumped out before the 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 federal agents jumped out, 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 before the federal agents jumped out. before the federal agents jumped out, 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 before federal agents jumped out, before the trucks even came to a complete stop. They drew their tactical weapons and aimed them directly at the cockpit window. They ordered the pilot over a megaphone to kill the engines immediately. The deafening roar of the jet turbines slowly wound down, spinning into a heavy, echoing silence. I stepped out of the command vehicle. The cold wind whipped across the flat concrete. Jamal stood right beside me. We watched as the heavy cabin door of the private jet slowly lowered to the tarmac. Marcus and his heavily armed team stormed up the stairs. Less than a minute later, they dragged Richard and Beatrice out of the luxurious cabin. They did not look like European nobility anymore. They looked like terrified, cornered rats. Richard was sweating profusely. His expensive jacket was wrinkled and stained. Beatrice had lost her designer heels and was stumbling down the metal stairs barefoot. Federal agents slammed them roughly against the side of the airplane. They aggressively kicked their legs apart to search them for weapons and contraband. A local news helicopter had picked up the police scanner chatter. It was hovering directly above us, shining a massive blinding spotlight down onto the runway. News vans were already pulling up to the broken perimeter fence. The cameras were rolling. The entire world was about to watch the final humiliating collapse of their fraudulent dynasty. As the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around their wrists, the illusion of their perfect family completely shattered. Richard twisted his head and glared at his wife. His face was purple with pure, unfiltered rage. "You stupid, greedy woman," Richard screamed. His voice cracked over the sound of the helicopter blades. "I told you this was a mistake. I told you we should have never tried to steal from these people. You and your psychotic daughter ruined everything." Beatrice did not shrink back. She lunged toward him, fighting against the grip of the federal agent holding her arms. "You pathetic, weak coward," she shrieked back. Her face twisted into an ugly snarl. "Do not blame me for your failures. You are the degenerate gambler who put a $10 million bounty on our heads. You gambled away our entire lives. You are not a man. You are a complete joke." They stood there in the blinding white light, cursing and spitting at each other. They threw away decades of marriage in 5 seconds just to save their own skin. They threw each other to the wolves, hoping to get a lighter prison sentence. They blamed each other for the fraud, the debt, and the destruction of their lives. It was the most pathetic, disgusting display of human frailty I had ever witnessed. I looked at Jamal, and he looked at me. We did not say a word. We did not need to. We both knew that a family built on lies and stolen money will always collapse under the weight of its own corruption. When the money dries up, the loyalty burns away instantly. The federal agents dragged the screaming couple toward the waiting transport vehicles. I watched them get shoved into the back seats, still hurling insults at one another. But something was terribly wrong. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. I turned to look at the open door of the private jet. Marcus walked slowly down the stairs, holding a single leather purse. His face was grim. Marcus walked over to me and shook his head. "The cabin is completely clear, Desmond," Marcus said. His voice was tight with frustration. We checked the bathrooms. We checked the cargo hold. We interviewed the pilot. Victoria was not on the plane. She had completely abandoned her own mother and father. She had let them drive to the airfield and board the jet, knowing full well that the federal government was tracking their every move. She used her own parents as a massive human decoy to draw the attention of the authorities while she slipped away into the shadows. She let them take the fall for the entire international money laundering operation. Jamal stared at the empty stairs of the private jet. The reality of the situation washed over him. He clenched his jaw, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "She set them up," Jamal whispered, staring into the dark tree line surrounding the airfield. "She knew we would track the tail number. She sacrificed her own flesh and blood just to buy herself a few hours of a head start." I looked down at the leather purse Marcus was holding. It was Victoria's bag. Inside was a burner phone and a few $100s. She had left it behind on purpose. It was a message. She wanted us to know that she was gone and that she had outsmarted the federal dragnet. She wanted us to know she was completely untethered now. Jamal turned to me, his eyes wide with a new creeping anxiety. "Dad, she has nothing left," Jamal said. His voice dropped to a harsh, worried whisper. "She has no money. She has no family. She has no future. She is like a snake. She will come back to bite us. She will not stop until she burns us down with her." I looked up at the dark sky, listening to the sirens wailing in the distance. The news chopper circled above, recording the aftermath of the raid. I knew my son was absolutely right. The federal government had captured the body of the beast, but the head was still slithering in the dark. Victoria was stripped of all her elegant disguises. She was no longer a corporate manipulator playing a long game of financial fraud. She was a desperate, violent fugitive with a deeply personal vendetta against the two men who had destroyed her entire universe. I placed my hand firmly on Jamal's shoulder. "Let her try," I said quietly. "A snake without a hole to hide in is just waiting to be stepped on. We are going back to the corporate headquarters right now." The game had shifted from a legal battlefield to raw physical survival. Victoria was out there in the dark, and I knew exactly where she was going to strike next. She wanted to destroy the one thing I valued as much as my family. She wanted to destroy my legacy. And I was going to be waiting for her when she arrived. I knew exactly where she was going. When you strip a predator of its fangs and corner it in the dark, it always returns to the site of its deepest hatred. Victoria hated my legacy. She hated the towering glass building that stood as a permanent monument to my success and her ultimate failure. She had lost her offshore accounts. She had lost her criminal syndicate. She had sacrificed her own parents to the federal authorities just to buy herself a few hours of freedom. But she still needed to destroy the evidence. She desperately believed that if she could wipe out the corporate servers, she could erase the digital paper trail that connected her to the embezzlement and the forged documents. I told Jamal to stay in the armored command vehicle with Marcus and the federal agents. They were waiting 3 blocks away, hidden in the shadows of the financial district. I told them to give me 10 minutes. I needed to do this completely alone. I needed to look the monster in the eye one last time without any police tape or lawyers standing between us. I walked into the main data center on the ground floor of the Vance Logistics headquarters. It was a massive, cavernous room filled with rows of towering black server racks. The temperature was kept perfectly cold to prevent the machines from overheating. The only light came from the thousands of tiny blue and green LED lights blinking rhythmically in the darkness. The low, constant hum of the cooling fans sounded like the heartbeat of the empire I had built. I stood in the center of the room, resting my hands in my pockets, and I waited in the cold, digital silence. At exactly 3:30 in the morning, the heavy, reinforced fire door at the back of the facility groaned in protest. I heard the sharp metallic snap of a crowbar breaking the exterior lock. The door was shoved open, letting in a brief gust of warm, humid city air before swinging shut. Footsteps echoed against the polished concrete floor. They were heavy, frantic, and uncoordinated. Then the harsh, toxic smell of cheap gasoline flooded the pristine server room, completely overpowering the sterile scent of the air conditioning. Victoria dragged herself into the aisle of servers. She looked absolutely horrific. The elegant, untouchable Silicon Valley socialite was completely dead. Her expensive white designer suit was torn and stained solid black with grease and alleyway dirt. Her blonde hair was matted to her skull. She had kicked off her high heels and was walking barefoot, leaving bloody footprints on the concrete. In her right hand, she carried a heavy red plastic gasoline canister. In her left hand, she held a cheap silver butane lighter. She began splashing the gasoline wildly across the expensive server racks. The clear liquid dripped down the black metal, pooling in dangerous, highly flammable puddles on the floor. She was panting heavily, sobbing and laughing at the exact same time. She was completely broken, existing in a state of pure manic delusion. "Put down the lighter." "Victoria," I said. My voice cut through the hum of the servers like a sharp, heavy blade. She shrieked in absolute terror, spinning around so fast she almost slipped in her own puddle of gasoline. She held the lighter up her thumb, resting dangerously close to the ignition trigger. Her wild, bloodshot eyes darted frantically through the shadows until they finally locked onto me. "You!" she hissed, her voice raspy and destroyed from hours of screaming. "How are you here? You should be hiding. You should be terrified of me." I took a slow, deliberate step forward into the dim blue light of the servers. "I am not terrified of a scared little girl throwing a temper tantrum in my building," I replied, my voice completely calm and devoid of any fear. "I knew you would come here. You have absolutely no money left to run and no place left to hide. This was your only desperate play." She raised the gasoline canister and splashed another wave of fuel onto the machine separating us. The fumes were growing overwhelmingly toxic. "I am going to burn it all down." "Desmond," she screamed, her chest heaving violently. "You took my parents from me. You took my money. You humiliated me in front of the entire world. Now I am taking your empire. I am going to incinerate every single digital record in this room. The federal agents cannot prosecute me if the financial evidence is reduced to ash. I will burn your legacy to the ground and walk away clean." She genuinely thought she was holding a loaded gun to the head of my company. She thought she was a brilliant tactical mastermind executing a flawless final strike to secure her freedom. I did not panic. I did not beg her to stop. I simply looked at her shivering, filthy, completely ruined figure, and I let out a low, soft laugh that echoed through the dark room. "Do you really think fire can burn cloud data, Victoria?" I asked, my tone dripping with absolute crushing pity. "You really are an amateur scammer." Her hand holding the lighter froze in midair, her manic breathing hitched. The horrific reality of my words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her eyes widening in sheer panic. "These are the main servers. The financial ledgers are on these drives." "You are pouring cheap gasoline on empty metal boxes," I explained, taking another step forward. "Vance Logistics is a global enterprise, Victoria. We process millions of shipments a day. Do you honestly believe we store our highly sensitive financial data on physical hardware sitting on the ground floor of a building in the city? The actual data is encrypted and distributed across military-grade cloud servers located in 3 different states." I paused, letting the absolute futility of her actions sink deep into her fractured mind. "And even if you could magically burn the cloud?" I continued mercilessly. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation already has the decrypted master drives. Jamal handed them the physical copies this morning. The evidence is sitting in a federal evidence locker right now, safely guarded by the United States government. You are not destroying my legacy, Victoria. You are just committing corporate vandalism. You have accomplished absolutely nothing." The silver lighter slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the concrete floor with a tiny hollow clatter, sliding away into the dark. The red gasoline canister dropped from her other hand, spilling the remaining fuel across her bare, bloody feet. The last remaining illusion, holding her shattered mind together, completely evaporated. She was not a mastermind. She was not a dangerous threat. She was just a filthy, pathetic criminal standing in a puddle of gas, realizing she had lost every single battle she had ever tried to fight. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the cold, hard floor right in the middle of the toxic fumes. She buried her face in her dirty hands and began to weep. It was not a calculated, manipulative cry. It was a deep, agonizing wail of total, absolute defeat. Before I could even speak another word, the deafening wail of police sirens shattered the silence of the night. The pulsing red and blue lights of dozens of federal vehicles and local police cruisers flooded through the front glass windows of the corporate lobby, illuminating the server room in a violent, chaotic strobe light. The cavalry had arrived. Marcus had given me exactly my 10 minutes. Heavy combat boots pounded across the lobby floor. The fire door flew open and a dozen heavily armed tactical agents stormed into the server room, sweeping their weapons through the darkness. "Do not move a muscle," an agent screamed, aiming his flashlight directly at the woman weeping on the floor. "Hands behind your back right now." Victoria did not fight. She did not try to run. She did not even look up. She slowly, mechanically moved her trembling hands behind her back. Two agents pulled her roughly from the puddle of gasoline and slammed her against the nearest metal server rack. The harsh metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around her wrists echoed through the room. It was the final, definitive sound of her destruction. They dragged her away toward the blinding lights of the police cruisers waiting outside. I stood in the dark, listening to the hum of the servers, watching her disappear into the night. She had gambled her freedom, her reputation, her stolen money, and her own family. And now she had absolutely nothing left but the cold, heavy chains binding her wrists. The war was officially over. The morning sun broke over the city skyline, casting a warm golden glow across the towering glass windows of the Vance Logistics executive suite. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my son Jamal, looking down at the waking city below. The streets were quiet. The aggressive news vans had finally packed up and left. The storm had passed and the air felt incredibly clear. We stood there in a comfortable, heavy silence. It was the silence of two men who had just walked through a raging fire and emerged completely untouched. We had successfully excised a massive toxic cancer from our lives and from our company. Jamal held a steaming mug of black coffee in his hands. He looked out over the empire I had built, and for the first time in almost a year, I saw pure, unburdened peace in his eyes. The justice system moved with surprising speed when a high-profile international fraud syndicate was handed to them on a silver platter. 6 months after that chaotic night in the server room, Victoria stood in a federal courtroom. She did not look like an elite Silicon Valley socialite anymore. She wore a standard orange prison uniform. Her blonde hair was dull and pulled back tightly. The judge did not show her a single ounce of mercy. The prosecution played the audio recordings. They displayed the forged medical documents. They presented the massive trail of international money laundering that linked her directly to the Eastern European mafia. She was convicted of federal racketeering, extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The judge slammed the heavy wooden gavel and sentenced her to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. She did not scream or cry when the sentence was read. She just stared at the floor, completely hollowed out by her own monumental greed. Her parents, Richard and Beatrice, faced their own brutal reckoning. They turned on each other viciously during the trial, completely destroying whatever was left of their miserable marriage in a desperate attempt to secure a plea deal. The federal prosecutor refused to negotiate with either of them. They were each sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The Russian mafia never got their $10 million, but they did not need to hunt the family down anymore. The United States government had permanently locked them in concrete cages. Back in the executive suite, Jamal turned to me and smiled. The board of directors had held an emergency meeting following the national media broadcast. They did not ask him to step down. They gave him a unanimous standing ovation. They realized that Jamal had successfully protected a billion-dollar conglomerate from a highly sophisticated, hostile takeover. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he possessed the cold, calculated brilliance required to lead Vance Logistics into the future. I officially signed over the final operational controls to him that very morning. My work was completely done. I spent 40 years fighting for respect, fighting for equity, and fighting for my family. Now I could finally put my sword down. I did not return to the corporate boardroom. I returned to the quiet, peaceful life I had truly earned. Every weekend I drive my old truck out to a quiet lake hidden deep in the countryside. I sit on a wooden dock, cast my fishing line into the still water, and listen to the birds. I do not have to pretend to be a frail, vulnerable old man anymore. I do not have to hide my power or my wealth to protect my son. We are safe. Our legacy is an absolute fortress. True power does not need to shout, and true wealth does not need to boast. When you underestimate people based on their age, their background, or the color of their skin, you expose nothing but your own lethal ignorance. Greed is a blinding poison. It makes you believe you are the smartest person in the room right up until the moment the trap snaps shut. Family is not a vulnerability to be exploited. It is an unbreakable fortress when built on trust and respect. Never mistake the silence of an old man for weakness. Sometimes the quietest kings are just letting the jesters dig their own graves. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you have ever had to stand up and fight back against someone who underestimated your true worth, please share your experience in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about protecting your family and demanding the respect you deserve. Stay strong, stay wise, and I will see you in the next video.